Her abusive ex followed her across state lines and walked straight into Limped's trap. Celine thought Milwaukee would be a fresh start until she came home and found her apartment door open. Grant was waiting in the lobby, smiling like nothing had changed, begging her to come home. Then the doors exploded open and Luca walked in with 3 men behind him. Grant wanted to drag her back into hell. Luca wanted to make sure he never touched her again. You and I are going to unpack a fascinating clinical case in psychological survival. We begin in a city of cold glass, a perfect incubator for unspoken trauma. Our subject, Celine, is a textbook victim, burying profound pain beneath heavy foundation. Her domestic partner has methodically conditioned her to erase her own existence. But this behavioral loop fractures when an apex predator enters the frame. Luca Darrow, operating with the chilling calculation of a megalomaniac, shatters her fragile silence with one precise question. Now, she is trapped between the abuser who breaks her in secret and a criminal kingpin whose protection demands her total submission. The psychological lesson is stark but true. Sometimes, to escape a relentless monster, a victim must find the courage to shake hands with the devil. The timeline begins at 6:47 in the morning, with rain striking the concrete like shattered glass. Celine displays a classic freeze response outside the apex tower, staring at the doors as if they represent a physical threat. Beneath her tailored blazer, her body endures severe trauma. A massive contusion spreads across her ribs, immune to expensive makeup. Her wrist throbs with a violent pulse, bearing the literal fingerprints of her partner, Grant. How does the human mind process such intimate violence? It relies heavily on cognitive dissonance. She swallows the toxic delusion she repeats every day, convincing her brain that the abuse was not that bad. The clinical takeaway here is deeply tragic. We often tell the most damaging and elaborate lies to our own reflections, simply to survive another day. In psychiatric terms, she is actively minimizing her trauma, desperately rationalizing that her abuser simply lost his temper. She navigates the marble lobby and takes the elevator to the 23rd floor. This space is a vast behavioral sink where endless corporate tasks quietly drain the spirit. Approaching her desk, she presses her forehead against the cold window, observing strangers on the street below. These are civilians who never have to conceal fresh defensive wounds or rehearse desperate apologies just to unlock their own front doors. A profound psychological truth emerges in this quiet observation. Everyday peace is a baseline human luxury that some victims only ever get to watch from a safe, distant window. Suddenly, her monitor flashes to life, and a flood of new demands instantly buries her fragile morning. Sifting through her inbox, a specific name triggers an immediate nervous system response. Luca Darrow. The mere sight of his name induces a heavy, suffocating dread. In behavioral profiling, Luca represents the pinnacle of dark triad traits. He understands that true dominance requires absolute silence. He controls half the luxury skyline in Chicago, operating a sophisticated syndicate masked by private security and dark logistics. Celine has only observed this apex predator 3 times. The first instance, he stalked across her floor, flanked by enforcers moving with the precise, lethal mechanics of trained killers. The psychological principle at play here is undeniably simple. True, lethal danger never actually has to raise its voice or make a visible threat to force an entire room into a state of absolute, freezing terror. The second time she saw him, he was projecting quiet, absolute authority by the elevators, but yesterday provides our crucial data point. Celine was delivering financial files to the boardroom, displaying her partner a severe limp. Her partner had violently thrown her against a kitchen counter the night before. She attempted to mask her physical impairment, gripping the folders tightly to suppress her tremors. But Luca possesses the hypersensitivity of a lifelong predator. He instantly pierced her psychological armor. He did not evaluate her with a standard gaze. His dark, calculating eyes dissected her movements exactly the way a hawk analyzes a wounded animal. The behavioral lesson is undeniable. You can never truly conceal the physical markers of your silent pain from a man who already lives entirely comfortably within the shadows. After the meeting, Luca utilized physical proximity to breach her comfort zone, quietly noting that she was favoring her left side. Celine experienced an immediate spike in cortisol. Panic flooded her system as she deployed her standard defense mechanism, forcing a smile and insisting she simply tripped. Luca did not break eye contact. He dismantled her rationalization with cold, surgical logic. He calmly explained the physics of human reflexes, pointing out that people who trip naturally fall forward to catch their weight. She, however, was actively guarding her ribs. The corridor plunged into a terrifying silence as her heart hammered against her bruised chest. The clinical lesson is remarkably simple. You cannot hide behind a clumsy fabrication when facing a man who has mastered the brutal mechanics of violence. You and I have analyzed enough case files to know exactly how this tragedy operates. Celine had spent years perfecting a pathological survival routine, deflecting blame and forcing hollow smiles through blinding trauma. But under the unwavering gaze of a syndicate boss, her practiced delusions crumbled. Still, she doubled down on her denial. Luca merely gave a slow, deliberate nod. Before withdrawing, he quietly stated that whenever she was ready to drop the facade, he would be waiting, sitting at her desk today. That psychological hook loops endlessly in her mind. This was not an expression of human empathy. It was a calculated, inescapable tether cast by a master manipulator. The lesson here is chilling. A painful, traumatic secret is never truly yours alone once a profoundly dangerous man decides to look closely. Her device buzzes with 4 new messages from Grant. A clinical review of his texts reveals the unhinged escalation of a violently insecure abuser, detailing dark threats for the evening. She deletes them. This simple swipe is a microscopic act of rebellion against an overwhelming psychological prison. At 10:30, her manager approaches with a fabricated corporate smile, delivering a massive structural shock to Celine's reality. She is ordered to a private briefing in conference room B. The terrifying variable? Luca Darrow has personally requested her. Celine experiences a severe bout of vertigo as the floor seems to vanish. Out of hundreds of invisible employees' eyes, the apex predator has isolated her. The behavioral lesson is terrifying. You can try to camouflage yourself in the shadows, but fate has a brutal method of dragging you into the blinding spotlight. Her manager advises her not to overthink the anomaly, vanishing before Celine can process the psychological shock. The agonizing wait mimics the severe anxiety of a prisoner anticipating the executioner. Seeking refuge in the restroom, Celine frantically reapplies her cosmetic armor with trembling hands. She stares into the mirror, ensuring the compliant corporate persona is fully activated. By 11 o'clock, she breaches the heavy-rated door to the conference room. Luca Darrow is seated perfectly still, displaying the lowered resting heart rate of a seasoned sociopath. He grips a metal pen with the casual readiness of a lethal weapon. His tailored suit functions as modern armor for an underworld monarch. The life lesson is undeniable. True Concentrated power never needs to raise its voice. It simply displaces the oxygen in the room. Two massive enforcers flank the windows, but Luca's predatory focus is locked entirely on his subject. He gestures to the empty leather chair beside him. The moment she complies, the psychological perimeter shrinks, turning the vast room into a suffocating cage. Luca slides a dossier across the table, bluntly stating that her financial proposal completely decimates the work of his analysts. When Celine stammers a nervous reflex of gratitude, Luca instantly severs the response. His vocal tone is clinically devoid of warmth. He clarifies that he does not deal in empty flattery. He only recognizes empirical data. He taps a specific metric, noting she caught an obscure deficit that would have cost him 6 figures. The clinical lesson here is absolute. When you are forced to sit at a table with starving wolves, your undeniable competence is the only armor that truly matters. Stick with me, because this is the exact moment the psychological power dynamic completely inverts. Luca methodically lists how she dismantled 3 corrupt vendor contracts his own accountants missed. Locking his dark eyes onto hers, he states she is either dangerously competent or his staff is completely useless. A microscopic smirk breaks his stoic mask. Then, the megalomaniac reveals his play. He is expanding operations to Milwaukee and requires a highly functional operator. Leaning into her personal space, he quietly states that he wants her for the role. Celine's traumatized nervous system short circuits. She asks if this is a corporate promotion. Luca ruthlessly kills that notion. He is offering a new illicit reality, massive wealth, and a direct escape. The psychological lesson is profound. An escape hatch constructed by a demon will always demand an irreversible toll on your soul. Let's open the case file. The subject, Celine, deploys a classic avoidance mechanism, asking the apex predator why he chose her. Luca, a textbook megalomaniacal narcissist, does not blink. He clinically isolates her, noting her hypervigilance, a trauma response she uses to scan for tiny details. He tells her she is superior to her environment, a calculated move to trigger her hidden wounds. Panic floods her nervous system. She attempts to buy time, begging for a week. Luca towers over the table, delivering the brutal psychological reality. Trauma does not vanish just because the victim chooses paralysis. Celine defaults to denial, feigning ignorance. Luca simply replies that she fully understands and vanishes, leaving her in a cold sweat. Listen to me on this one. Freezing in the headlights of your own nightmare never stops the crash. Observe the subject in her sterile habitat. Celine sits bathed in the pale light of her monitor, using rows of data as a dissociative shield. Between noon and 8, the cortisol loop triggers 17 times. It is Grant. Each text is a chaotic escalation of his profound insecurity. She stares at the glare, her breathing shallow, and deletes them all, a compulsive ritual of erasure that alters absolutely nothing. Outside, the environment mirrors her desolation. Rain lashes the asphalt, transforming the roads into black mirrors reflecting red neon as she begins the agonizing transit back to her active crime scene. We see this cognitive trap frequently. Sometimes, the most impenetrable prison is the one the victim willingly unlocks and returns to, night after excruciating night. The environment here is crucial for our clinical understanding. The train carriage S fluorescent bulbs wash the vitality right out of her skin, highlighting the hollow exhaustion of chronic hypervigilance. She prefers the friction of wet wool and anonymous strangers to the terrifying isolation of her own hallway. She drags herself up 3 flights of concrete stairs, her ribs radiating a dull, somatic ache from the previous night's physical trauma. As her key touches the lock, the deadbolt violently snaps back. Grant fills the doorframe, his jaw clenched in the classic pre-strike tension of a primary aggressor. His green eyes are undeniably striking in the dim light. Yet, the diagnostic reality remains absolute. A symmetrical, beautiful face is nothing more than an evolutionary trick when the mind behind it operates like a starving, remorseless predator. Let us analyze the immediate escalation. The humanity in those striking eyes is entirely absent, replaced by the flat affect of a controller losing his grip. He interrogates her, his voice a weapon designed to disorient. Celine shrinks, assuming a submissive posture as she enters a space thick with the depressive stench of stale alcohol and chronic failure. She attempts to bypass him, but his hand snaps out, locking around her wrist like a vice. He does not fracture the radius, not yet, but the calibrated pressure is a somatic guarantee of future violence. When she whispers her exhaustion, he throws his head back with a hollow, cruel laugh, actively minimizing her reality. It is a textbook tactic of psychological warfare. Pathological controllers will deliberately shrink your legitimate fatigue into nothing, gaslighting you into feeling utterly insane for demanding a baseline of peace. What follows is a masterclass in coercive control. He violates her physical boundary, his breath hot against her skin, demanding a confession to an imaginary betrayal. Celine offers the sterile truth of a late shift with her employer. In response, Grant deliberately drives his thumb into the mottled tissue of her existing bruise, merging past trauma with present agony. He whispers his accusations, letting the psychological terror suffocate her before casually discarding her arm like inanimate refuse. She retreats to the bedroom, yet deliberately leaves the door unlocked. On Porty, she knows locking it only provides the aggressor an excuse to shatter the barrier. You and I need to look closely at this dynamic, well, closely enough to see the truth. Chronically managing the trigger of an unexploded bomb in your home is an entirely different mechanism than actual love. We observe her on the mattress, her nervous system braying for a digital assault. Instead, the screen illuminates a message from an apex predator offering sanctuary. He writes that if she needs to leave, his security team can assist, with 0 questions asked. It is signed simply with the letter L. For a subject trapped in abuse, the sudden introduction of a viable escape route is cognitively blinding. Overwhelmed by the sheer terror of agency, she deletes the lifeline. By Wednesday, Grant initiates the honeymoon phase of the abuse cycle. He presents cheap floral arrangements, kisses the tissue he damaged, and rationalizes his violence as stress. We must understand the mechanics of this survival strategy. Often, a victim will consume the toxic placebo of a temporary truce simply to gather the biological energy required to survive the ongoing war. The environment shifts dramatically on Thursday. Luca summons her to the 32nd floor, a physical elevation that mirrors his psychological dominance. The office is an architectural projection of cold, unyielding power, reducing the sprawling city below to insignificant variables. He bypasses social pleasantries, his vocal tone calibrated and heavy. He reads her terror with clinical precision. Celine immediately erects a defensive perimeter, forcefully denying her vulnerability. Luca simply reclines, his dark eyes systematically dissecting her defense mechanisms. He presents her with the ultimate behavioral dilemma, weighing the paralyzing fear of the unknown against the agonizing certainty of her current domestic torture. It is a fundamental psychological threshold we all must eventually cross. Her defenses finally shatter, her voice cracking as she falsely claims he knows nothing about her reality. The behavioral dynamics in this office are completely asymmetrical. Luca is operating with total informational supremacy. He paces the perimeter of the room, maintaining a calculated distance while systematically dismantling her secrets. His voice remains a steady, hypnotic rumble as he outlines her cognitive dissonance. He notes she possesses a brilliant analytical mind, yet expends her daily energy concealing contusions and enduring domestic terrorism. Celine's somatic reaction is instant, her hands balling into fists as she attempts to reclaim autonomy, snapping that he has no right to examine her trauma. Luca concedes the point without ego, yet extends the lifeline anyway, a relocation to Milwaukee, a total systemic reset. He demands she abandon her delusions. Take this clinical observation to heart. The surgical precision of the truth often causes deeper lacerations than physical violence, but it is the only procedure capable of excising the rot. Luca establishes a rigid boundary, clarifying this is a strategic acquisition, not an act of charity. He imposes a hard deadline. The offer expires on Monday, forcing her out of analytical paralysis. When Friday evening arrives, her fragile domestic environment predictably implodes. She enters the apartment to find the air saturated with ethanol and volatile aggression. Grant is severely intoxicated, his cognitive reasoning entirely offline. The verbal assault begins instantly, a projection of his own profound inadequacies manifesting as accusations of infidelity. He closes the distance with terrifying speed, seizing her center of mass and launching her violently into the structural drywall. Glass from a framed picture detonates across the carpet. Let this psychological reality anchor you. You can pour an infinite ocean of love into a fundamentally broken individual, and it will never, ever be enough to cure the malignant pathology of their own self-hatred. The physical escalation reaches its critical apex. Grant's hand locks securely around her trachea. He applies enough pressure to restrict oxygen, but not enough to crush the cartilage, a calculated demonstration of absolute dominance over her mortality. His toxic breath washes over her as he verbalizes his paranoid delusions. As her brain becomes hypoxic and her vision fragments into dark static, he abruptly releases the hold. She collapses, her starved lungs violently fighting for oxygen. Instantly, Grant's defense mechanisms activate. He assumes the posture of the victim, spilling frantic apologies to mitigate his guilt. Celine finally refuses to participate in the delusion and flees. Stick with me here, I mean, really listen to this part. An apology issued in the immediate aftermath of physical trauma is never actual remorse. It is simply a down payment, securing his right to commit the next assault. Her adrenaline reserves completely deplete by the time she reaches the concrete stairwell. She collapses, her fine motor skills failing as she grips the phone. The psychological warfare within her is profound. Her ego insists she must navigate this threat independently, warning her against accumulating debt with a known apex predator. But her biological imperative to survive overrides the cognitive dissonance. She makes the call. Luca's vocal effect remains absolutely flat, his emotional detachment acting as an anchor in her chaos. He issues a direct, simple command to remain concealed. Exactly 15 minutes later, a heavily armored sedan materializes. A massive operative scans the environment, locates her, and calmly identifies himself as Mr. Devo's asset. Never forget the clinical truth of this moment. Stripping away the heavy, useless armor of your own ego and begging for extraction is often the absolute highest manifestation of human courage. The extraction specialist uses a low, modulated tone to de-escalate her hyperarousal, guaranteeing her immediate security. Celine forces her failing musculature to comply, pulling herself into the reinforced cabin of the vehicle. For the very first time in 36 months, she severs the psychological tether, departing the geographical center of her trauma without a single backward glance. The armored transport glides through the slick, rain-soaked grid like a phantom. The operative up front is a model of disciplined detachment, actively monitoring for pursuit. The claustrophobic architecture of the city dissolves, replaced by a quiet quadrant of sprawling estates. Today, you and I have watched a subject finally break her conditioning. Sometimes, hurling yourself blindly into the terrifying abyss of the unknown is the only mathematically viable strategy left to preserve your own existence. Let us open this case file together and examine the initial phase of the transference. The driver escorts Celine to a private elevator, an isolated transport, sealing her off from her previous trauma. The doors close, bringing her to a silent, glass-walled penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline. This environment is meticulously curated by Luca. Note his posture, hands buried in his pockets, observing the rain. He presents himself not as a threat, but as an absolute authority. He informs her she is safe, a classic tactic of psychological realignment. Listen to me closely on this behavioral principle. The ultimate exertion of control over a broken psyche is not violence. It is providing an impenetrable sanctuary, replacing her chaos with his order. Observe the physical symptoms of her severe trauma response. Celine remained entirely paralyzed in the shadowed hallway, exhibiting violent tremors. Her nervous system is bracing for the punishment her previous environment always demanded. Luca stands before her, a massive physical barrier blocking out the dark. He offers warmth and shelter, asking for absolutely nothing in return. To the clinical eye, this is a fascinating disruption of her conditioned reflexes. He recognizes her battered state and deliberately rewrites the rules of her survival. The behavioral lesson here is deeply profound. Authentic human intervention does not demand a transaction. The right person will simply pull you from the wreckage because they possess the power to do so. We see her enter the unfamiliar bedroom, acting entirely on survival conditioning. Notice the heavy metal click of the deadbolt locking into place. This is ingrained muscle memory, formed from years of anticipating sudden physical strikes. Upon hitting the mattress, her psychological dam finally collapses. Her tears are driven not by acute pain, but by the overwhelming shock of being caught by a stranger's safety net. When she awakens, the sensory deprivation of the penthouse is striking. No screaming, no heavy footsteps, just absolute, clinical silence. Her central nervous system slowly processes that the immediate threat is gone. It is a fundamental truth of the human condition. The most difficult adjustment for any trauma victim is accepting that they are allowed to exist entirely without fear. Examine the contrast in this sterile, perfectly controlled environment. On the nightstand, her phone flashes continuously, representing the pathology of her abuser. Grant has left 43 missed calls and 67 frantic messages. You and I recognize this cycle perfectly. It is the predictable oscillation between sobbing remorse and terrifying, violent rage. She completely ignores the device. Stepping to the mirror, she confronts the physical evidence of her captivity. Dark contusions map the jawline, and clear finger marks are stamped into her throat. Yet, a crucial psychological shift occurs in her reflection. A quiet defiance begins to form. In order to permanently sever a trauma bond, the subject must first look directly at the monster's work without flinching or looking away. We must rewind the timeline to analyze the intake process. Celine arrived at his door, exhibiting signs of severe clinical shock. Luca quickly processed the strangulation marks on her neck and immediately bypassed standard authorities. He summoned Dr. Brennan, a medical professional who operates in the gray areas of this criminal ecosystem. The doctor calmly documented the blunt force trauma with a camera. Celine remained completely dissociated, trapped in the emotional anesthesia that follows intense physical abuse. The flash illuminated every mark of violence Grant had inflicted. This is a critical step in behavioral recovery. When an abuser attempts to destroy your reality, the most effective countermeasure is allowing an outside observer to record the damage. Evidence breaks the illusion of isolation. As the medical examination concluded, the doctor delivered a chilling prognosis. She coldly informed Celine that surviving this encounter without fractured bones was a statistical anomaly, and such probabilities rapidly decrease over time. The terror of that assessment sinks deeply into Celine's consciousness. We routinely see victims paralyzed by the dread of resuming their daily routine. However, as she enters the main living space, the environmental stimuli radically shift. The aroma of roasted coffee grounds fills the air. Morning sunlight floods the marble surfaces, casting the violent city below in a warm, forgiving light. This biological reset is essential for therapeutic progress. Regardless of the severity of the psychological trauma endured, the dawn provides a mandatory physical reset for the brain. Celine moves toward the kitchen, where we observe Luca. Let us evaluate his posture together. An apex predator of the underworld, he is completely relaxed against the island, offering a hot cup of coffee. She grips the ceramic tightly, grounding herself in the tactile sensation. He informs her she has been unconscious for 14 solid hours. Then the tension returns. Luca notes the relentless ringing of her phone and poses a fascinating, open-ended proposition. Do you want me to handle it? When she weakly asks how, his response is entirely adaptable to her psychological needs. He tells her he will do whatever she requires. The behavioral takeaway is clear. True security is found in those willing to assume the burden of action when your own cognitive reserves are completely depleted. Luca maintains complete physical stillness, yet his baseline aggression is palpable. Celine anxiously inquires about his methods. His gaze is utterly devoid of empathy for the abuser. He presents two divergent protocols. She can utilize the traditional legal framework, or she can authorize his specific brand of permanent resolution. Celine experiences a moral panic, pleading with him to avoid a lethal outcome. Luca calibrates his response, lowering his voice to a chilling baseline. He guarantees the subject will survive, but will be permanently excised from her environment. This illustrates a vital truth about human confrontation. Establishing a psychological boundary is merely a suggestion. Actively and ruthlessly enforcing it is the only true mechanism for ensuring your own survival. I want you to examine this specific interaction with me. Celine looks out over the vast city, observing the normative behaviors of people unaffected by chronic fear. She confesses a complete inability to process the future. Luca does not apply pressure. Instead, he delivers a clinical assessment of the sociopathic mind. He states that predators like Grant do not respond to logical requests or judicial documentation. Their compulsion to dominate only ceases when their capacity to do so is forcibly removed. This is a fundamental law of behavioral pathology. You cannot reason with an entity that derives sustenance from your psychological deterioration. When dealing with a malignant narcissist, the only effective treatment is total containment. You must systematically sever all avenues of access to your reality. The heavy oak door secures the perimeter as Luca departs with his enforcement detail. He leaves Celine with a direct line to his personal device, avoiding any suffocating overprotection. Isolated, Celine attempts to self-regulate with a book, but her cognitive load is entirely consumed by anxiety. The phone vibrates constantly, a digital manifestation of her abuser's escalating panic. Grant's communication exhibits classic volatility, oscillating wildly between frantic weeping and homicidal hostility. Then the ultimate escalation arrives in text form. He claims he is approaching her location. It is imperative to understand the mechanics of this behavior. When a manipulator realizes their control matrix is failing, their ensuing panic has nothing to do with affection. It is purely an aggressive, desperate retrieval tactic. The psychological impact of that message triggers an immediate stress response. Then the device rings. It is Luca, bypassing pleasantries to deliver tactical data. Grant has breached the building's exterior. Security monitors show the subject striking the reinforced glass, highly intoxicated and fueled by narcissistic rage. Celine experiences acute respiratory distress, but Luca's calm frequency acts as an immediate grounding technique. He presents her with a clinical binary choice. His security personnel can transfer the subject to law enforcement, or Luca can personally conduct a behavioral correction in the lobby. We frequently observe this phenomenon in trauma recovery. When an individual's defense mechanisms are entirely shattered, the intervention of a dominant protective force is often the exact catalyst needed for true liberation. We have reached the critical junction of this psychological study. Celine weakly asks to define the parameters of this proposed conversation. Luca's response is an auditory display of apex dominance. He promises an interaction that will permanently rewire the subject's risk assessment. She pleads for non-lethal methods. Luca confirms he will not leave physical marks, yet his vocal tone implies a far more profound psychological dismantling. She gives the authorization. 2 hours of intense anticipatory anxiety pass before the elevator chimes. Luca enters, exhibiting zero physiological signs of elevated stress. He pours a measure of whiskey and delivers a definitive clinical update. It is resolved. This confirms a fundamental behavioral truth. Absolute authority never requires elevated volume. The most devastating psychological strikes are always delivered in total silence. You and I must examine the pathology of this moment. Observe Luca taking a calculated sip of whiskey. He exhibits the chilling dominance of a megalomaniac narcissist. Approaching Grant, he established unbroken eye contact and decreased Celine was now his territory. Weaponizing the medical evidence, he offered a binary choice: face severe felony charges or vanish completely. When Celadine questions his extortion, Luca's physiological arousal remains entirely flat. He clinically classifies his threats as mere objective facts. Here is a psychological truth to carry with you. Abusers exclusively consume the anxiety of their targets. When you establish an unyielding boundary and deliver reality without a single flinch, the cowards who fed on your fear will always collapse into nothing. The tension mirrors a clinical interrogation. Luca locks onto Celine, showing zero remorse as he details dismantling Grant's existence, the dead-end job, the alcohol dependency, the debts. He forced one exit strategy, which was complete erasure. Celine begins to decompensate, trembling as she accuses him of developing a god complex. Luca's affect remains blunted. I can, and I did. He confirms, his tone a predatory rumble. When she insists this conflict was not his, he dissects her panic. You asked for help, and this is what it looks like. Let this be a behavioral lesson we all absorb. We must stop experiencing misplaced guilt when a capable protector steps in. Sometimes, you must allow another person to hold the heavy shield while your traumatized nervous system finally heals. Celine erects psychological barricades, pacing with the hyperarousal of a cornered animal. She rejects his assistance, interpreting his intervention as a manipulative control dynamic. She accuses him of leveraging violence to manufacture her dependency, the foundational seeds of Stockholm Syndrome. Suddenly, Luca's sociopathic exterior fractures. Because I actually care, he snaps, his baseline control slipping into raw disclosure. Celine is paralyzed. Dropping his volume, he confesses to studying her daily behavioral patterns, watching her mask her agony while Grant systematically shattered her psyche. Maintaining such a facade requires catastrophic cognitive energy. Here is a tragic truth about trauma. The heavy defenses we construct to block our abusers are frequently the exact same barriers that starve us of the connection we require to survive. The psychological density in the room is suffocating. Luca admits that observing the contusions on her throat caused him acute distress. He swears to repeatedly execute the same criminal behaviors, not to possess her, but to ensure her environment remains devoid of terror. Celine attempts to establish distance, claiming he cannot possibly understand her. Luca clinically bypasses her rusted defenses. He diagnoses her condition, noting she equates accepting security with fatal vulnerability. Having operated in chronic fight or flight mode, she has forgotten baseline functioning. Her emotional regulation collapses. She weeps, asking what happens next. Luca physically retreats, transferring the locus of control back to her. Stay, run, or vanish. Remember this profound truth. Authentic strength is never defined by holding the leash. It is demonstrated by handing a captive the keys to their own cage. The predictable pattern of violence reemerges before sunrise. Grant displays the classic impulsivity of an abuser, violating his restraining order. Celine remains unconscious when Luca's device signals at 6 in the morning. 30 seconds is all he requires. He issues 3 tactical directives, maneuvering assets like a cartel leader. Before Celine wakes, the threat is neutralized. She discovers Luca consuming black coffee, analyzing footage of Grant's severe emotional dysregulation at the perimeter cameras. Luca's effect is a dead sociopathic flatline. He clinically notes the subject tracked her vehicle on Friday. Let you and I examine this reality together. Malignant personalities universally misinterpret mercy as weakness. When an abuser blatantly violates a clearly defined boundary, they are systematically begging for a devastating consequence. An acute panic response spikes in Celine's nervous system as she demands her abuser's location. Luca maintains an unnerving serenity. He clinically notes the subject is detained in a holding cell until Monday. Afterward, the variables become chaotic. A judge might authorize bail, or Luca's legal operatives might bury him. Luca then dismantles her remaining illusion of safety. Grant has identified the safe house. The sanctuary is compromised. Celine experiences a dissociative drop, questioning their protocol. Luca's executive functioning has already finalized the extraction. She is relocating to a secure environment in Milwaukee. Listen closely to this clinical wisdom. Executing a tactical retreat from a toxic threat is never a surrender. It is a highly calculated strategy to guarantee your own mental stability. Presents a critical behavioral fork in the road. she can initiate relocation or authorize him to neutralize Grant using extreme prejudice. Celine inquires about the parameters. Luca's micro-expressions vanish into a sociopathic void. A terrifying predatory capability radiates from his physiology. He asks if she possesses the psychological fortitude to process the forensic details. She evaluates the abyss of his criminal history and intelligently declines. By 1200 hours, she is secured inside a tinted sedan accelerating north on Interstate 94. The extraction was executed with terrifying efficiency. Luca's network meticulously erased her physical footprint, sanitizing even the apartment she shared with her abuser. Here is the bitter psychological reality we must accept. Carefully evaluate your defensive maneuvers. Some doors, once forced open by severe violence, will fundamentally alter your reality forever. Prior to extraction, Celine executed binding non-disclosure agreements. She was provisioned with what analysts call golden handcuffs, financial assets, and a lucrative contract designed to enforce compliance. Now, confined in the rear passenger compartment, the sensory deprivation is profound. Her driver is the same enforcement asset from Friday, maintaining operational silence. Celine observes the Chicago skyline receding, experiencing the profound psychological displacement common in witness protection. Her mobile device vibrates. An encrypted message dictates her access credentials await at a Third Ward facility. She fixates on the text until her optical focus degrades, then terminates the device's power. Let me provide a critical observation regarding behavioral resets. Stepping into the unknown generates acute neurological terror, but passively remaining in a cycle of abuse is a guaranteed death sentence. The Milwaukee Sanctuary functions as a high-end containment unit. It is an 8th-floor penthouse featuring expansive windows overlooking a dark river. The environment is structurally flawless, yet psychologically sterile. Celine exhibits a severe freeze response, her somatic memory simulating the phantom pressure of Grant's hands on her trachea. She re-engages her device. It rings instantly. Her autonomic nervous system spikes, but the caller is Luca. His resonant vocal timbre dominates the sterile space, clinically verifying the suitability of her habitat. She reports it is excessive, yet precisely adequate. Luca dictates he will arrive tomorrow to define her operational parameters. She exhibits minor vocal tremors before expressing gratitude. Remember this psychological axiom. You can construct an impenetrable fortress of wealth, but authentic neurological regulation is an entirely internal mechanism. Monday initiates with a knock. Luca's behavioral profile rejects half measures. He arrives at 900 hours, flanked by vigilant security. He enters her space carrying 2 coffees, handing her a black, unsweetened beverage. Celine questions his data collection regarding her preferences. I monitor the variables, he clinically responds. That gesture provides a fragment of neurological safety. Luca extracts dossiers from his briefcase. He forces her engagement, reviewing logistical frameworks and security parameters. Celine processes the documents, her prefrontal cortex overwhelmed by the load of her new reality. Analyze his methodology. Legitimate rescue never concludes with mere extraction. It requires providing operational tools, allowing the victim to forge their own armor. Celine exhibits cognitive overload, vocalizing that the restructuring is overwhelming. Luca systematically overrides her self-doubt. Now, you and I are likely formulating the exact query she voices next. Why does an apex predator invest such resources into a traumatized subordinate? Luca creates physical distance. Observing the river below, initiating a rare disclosure of childhood trauma. His voice hollows out. At 16, he states, he observed his father inflict massive blunt force trauma on his mother. He was paralyzed by terror. Within 5 years, the abuser terminated her life. Luca locks onto Celine with terrifying intensity. He made a binding cognitive pact to never experience powerlessness again. We must recognize this truth. Resilient psychological profiles never repress core trauma. They weaponize their darkest memories, forging them into a shield to protect the innocent. The acoustic report of his attaché closing reverberates like ballistic fire. You and I recognize the significance of that trigger. The dissociative trance is terminated. He processes Celine, yet through his unresolved trauma, he projects the phantom of his deceased mother. His jaw constricts with repressed rage. He strictly compartmentalizes, refusing to let historical trauma contaminate the room. Celine questions his intervention. Is this genuine salvation or pathological survivor's guilt? Luca encroaches on her perimeter, his eyes resembling the cold void of an open grave, swearing Grant will never draw breath near her again. Her initial integration devolves into a punishing cycle of 12-hour shifts and flatlined sleep. Observe this psychological tragedy. Subjecting your system to extreme labor, to outpace internal demons, does not neutralize them. It merely forces the monsters to wait in your subconscious. Open this case file together and observe the subject, Celine. We see her in a perfectly sterile office, exhibiting classic hyperarousal. For a survivor of severe psychological abuse, silence is not peaceful. It is a vacuum waiting to be filled by the abuser's voice. The phantom weight of her tormentor, Grant, still suffocates her. She attempts to self-soothe through the repetitive compulsion of paperwork, but trauma rarely stays buried. On a Thursday afternoon, her phone vibrates, a Chicago area code. A physiological panic response hijacks her nervous system. She forces herself to answer, only to hear the voice of a Detective Morris. The lesson here is quite simple. You can relocate and change your identity, but unresolved trauma never loses your forwarding address. The clinical term for Grant's behavior is institutional abuse. Fresh from a holding cell, this malignant narcissist walked into a Chicago precinct to file a missing person report. The sheer pathology of the act is staggering. He stood under fluorescent police lights and fabricated a narrative where his victim was the one stolen from him. We watch Celine grip her desk, her knuckles white as the blood drains from her extremities. The detective informs her that Grant is accusing her new employer of kidnapping. The silence that follows is a textbook trauma freeze response. Remember this cold reality of human behavior. Those who shatter your psyche will not hesitate to manipulate the very legal frameworks designed to protect you, turning the law itself into a weapon of control. Operating from a state of pure survival, Celine agrees to the detective's meeting. She is entirely hollowed out by Grant's pathological lies. Notice how her trembling fingers immediately reach for a new authority figure. She dials Luca. As she details the fabricated police report, the line falls dead silent. Clinically speaking, this is the calculated stillness of an apex predator deciding how to dismantle a threat. His deep voice finally cuts through her panic. He promises his syndicate will bury the precinct in contradictory evidence. He demands only her complete submission and trust in return. This reveals a profound truth about vulnerability. Allowing a deeply dangerous individual to step into the fire and fight your battles will irrevocably alter the trajectory of your life. Friday, the immediate stressor appears neutralized. Detective Morris calls back, his tone shifted. He admits Luca's operatives flooded the department with evidence, dismantling Grant's psychological projection. Celine experiences a massive cortisol drop, her shoulders falling as if she has been starving for oxygen. Grant is ordered to stay away. For one fragile afternoon, she feels the illusion of safety. But look closely at the behavioral pattern. The relief lasts a mere 6 hours. When she arrives at her apartment that evening, the environmental baseline shifts. Her door is cracked open, bleeding a sliver of darkness into the hall. Never forget this reality. A false sense of security is often the most lethal trap a survivor can blindly walk into. Her heart accelerates into severe tachycardia. Operating on pure instinct, she contacts her new protector. Luca answers instantly, his voice a sharp command to retreat while he mobilizes. Celine does not freeze this time. Her flight response takes over. She bolts down the concrete emergency stairs, but as she reaches the lobby, the heavy echo of boots forces a sudden halt. We observe Grant standing in the doorway. Physically, he exhibits signs of severe decompensation, unshaven, wild eyes, manic posture. Yet, he produces the exact same charming, calculated smile he used to initially groom her. Always remember this terrifying fact. The most destructive predators rarely hide in the shadows. They approach wearing the familiar face of someone you once loved. Celine retreats, her eyes dilated with terror. She attempts verbal de-escalation, but Grant is consumed by his delusion. He steps forward, reciting manic declarations of love. Watch Celine's breakthrough. She refuses to regress into submission. She plants her feet. The second she asserts a firm boundary, his romantic fantasy collapses into narcissistic rage. He lunges. Before his hands make contact, the doors explode open. Luca enters the environment with terrifying velocity. Luca issues a quiet, lethal command. When Grant displays the poor judgment to resist, Luca drives him into the marble wall with bone-cracking force. Keep this lesson close. A genuine protector does not offer empty words. They become an uncompromising physical barrier between you and absolute destruction. Grant's obsessive pursuit blinded him to external variables. He never factored a dominant predator like Luca into his behavioral model. Luca looks down at the broken man, his affect completely flat. With a single strike, he drops Grant to the floor. The sickening thud of bone against tile registers as a definitive end to the threat. Luca straightens his cuffs, demonstrating a chilling emotional detachment from the violence. Yet, when he turns to Celine, his gaze shifts into a state of profound empathy. She is in shock. This lethal individual just executed brutal vengeance, but treats her like fragile glass. She asks why he let her abuser live. Luca simply states it was because she asked him to. Let this truth sink in. Someone who truly values you will respect your boundaries, even when their instincts demand violence. With her former abuser groaning on the tile, Celine experiences a rare moment of absolute cognitive clarity. You and I are going to examine this critical psychological crossroads together. She could flee, attempting to vanish from both her toxic abuser and her violent protector, or she could embrace the trauma bond forming with Luca. As sirens wail, she makes an irreversible choice. She walks directly to Luca, asking him to take her somewhere safe. He studies her micro-expressions, silently verifying her consent before guiding her out. Grant screams her name, but Celine effectively dissociates from his existence. Here is a vital clinical lesson. To preserve your sanity, you must completely sever ties with the source of your trauma and refuse to ever look back. Celine watches the skeletal trees blur past the tinted windows. Neither subject speaks. It is the heavy, dissociative silence that follows an acute stress event. The auditory hallucination of Grant's screaming still loops in her memory, linked to the brutal crunch of Luca's fist. Logically, she knows she should feel liberated, yet a freezing emotional numbness washes over her. She feels complicit, recognizing she has crossed a severe moral boundary by utilizing Luca's aggression. Here is a painful truth about human resilience. Surviving severe trauma does not mean your pain simply evaporates the second the abuser is neutralized. The psychological scars remain highly active. The vehicle slows as massive iron gates swing open, revealing an isolated compound hidden in the falling snow. Luca's guards execute a perimeter sweep with military precision, their hypervigilance indicating a lifestyle of constant paranoia. Luca steps into the freezing air, offering Celine his hand. As the wind triggers a shiver, Luca responds with a non-verbal display of care. He sheds his heavy coat and drapes it over her, establishing a physical barrier against the cold. They proceed into a cavernous foyer built of dark stone. To an analyst, this is clearly not a typical residence. It is a fortified structure designed to isolate its inhabitants from external threats. Suddenly, his phone shatters the silence. Take this simple lesson with you. It is consistently the quiet, protective behaviors, rather than loud verbal promises, that demonstrate who is truly capable of anchoring you in a crisis. You and I see the sociopathic reality operating behind the curtain. Luca speaks into his phone, his vocal tone entirely flat, ordering his men to keep Grant contained. He calmly informs Celine that her abuser will remain in a holding cell indefinitely. Celine's brow furrows as she processes this cognitive dissonance. She asks how anyone can guarantee a judicial outcome. Luca delivers the Machiavellian truth without a single micro-expression of guilt. He simply states that he owns the judge. Celine experiences a profound psychological freefall as he casually pours 2 glasses of whiskey, unfazed by his own corruption. Listen closely to this harsh lesson. Realizing that societal structures are inherently rigged is terrifying, but learning how to survive within those broken systems will permanently change your life. Luca extends the glass, but Celine remains locked in behavioral paralysis. She questions if he truly owns a judge. Luca does not break eye contact. He corrects her, stating he owns several. She labels this as corruption, relying on her conventional moral framework. He clinically reframes it as survival. To Luca, the justice system is merely a tool manipulated by narcissists like Grant to gaslight their victims. Celine argues that society requires fair laws, her hands trembling as her worldview collapses. His gaze turns to absolute ice as he asks if those laws ever actually protected her. We all must face this painful truth. The institutional rules we blindly trust to maintain order are often the exact mechanisms that leave us entirely defenseless against the true predators operating in plain sight. Let us step back and examine the clinical mechanics of this confrontation. Luca methodically dismantles her fragile psychological defenses. Despite a legal order, Grant destroyed her door, and law enforcement remained paralyzed until Luca forced intervention. He encroaches on her physical space, his shadow acting as a dominance display, warning her to abandon her cognitive dissonance after 3 agonizing years. The reality strikes like blunt force trauma. Celine drops her glass, her fine motor skills failing as panic constricts her airway. She flees into the hall, where heavy snow buries the estate grounds. You and I have seen this trauma response before. The most difficult reality to process is always the exact truth a victim has spent years actively repressing. The atmospheric tension in the corridor thickens, weighted by absolute finality. Luca maintains a rigid posture, a micro-expression of tension feathering his jaw. He recognizes his aggressive psychological push, yet deems shattering her denial entirely necessary. Celine emits a hollow laugh that echoes off the harsh stone architecture. She projects his criminal pathology back at him, equating his syndicate of corrupted officials to Grant's domestic control. Luca closes the distance, employing a classic narcissistic deflection. Insisting he is nothing like her abuser, he quietly isolates her choices, reminding her that she initiated that midnight call. We must observe this grim psychological rule. Sometimes, physical survival requires a victim to actively align with a terrifying predator. Luca drives the brutal reality of her trauma directly into her nervous system. He clinically asks if she prefers the predictable suffocation of Grant's abuse over the chaotic autonomy he offers. The accusation triggers a physiological recoil. She whispers that his psychological manipulation is fundamentally unjust. They remain suspended in the dim light, the tension sharp enough to draw blood. Soon, the predatory posture drains from his shoulders. He offers her the East Wing, a calculated illusion of choice: stay in his fortress, or freeze in the winter elements. As the megalomaniac fades into the shadows, Celine collapses, sobbing until her ribs ache. Here is a clinical reality you and I must accept. A shattered psyche must hit absolute bedrock before any genuine rebuilding can occur. The guest chamber operates as a textbook gilded cage, designed to pacify a captive. A fire warms the antique furnishings, and a vast bed waits beneath silk sheets. Tailored clothing sits ready, displaying his obsessive surveillance of her physical dimensions. Celine moves through the room with dissociated steps. She scrubs her face with freezing water until the fragmented woman in the mirror aligns with her identity. Wandering the sprawling mansion, she discovers fresh coffee and a handwritten directive to rest. Luca casually mentions his armed paramilitaries have secured the perimeter. It is a brilliant, terrifying enclosure. This brings us to an inescapable human truth. Vast material wealth means nothing when it merely decorates the walls of your own psychological prison. Celine anchors herself to the warm mug, observing the winter frost paralyze the estate. Her focus drifts to her phone, where 23 missed calls illuminate the screen. She engages the audio, and Grant's slurred voice fills the sterile room. He deploys the identical cycle of toxic contrition she has endured for years. He frantically attempts to gaslight her, projecting his own predatory nature onto the Mafia boss. Celine exhibits a breakthrough in boundary enforcement. She deletes the file, terminating his manipulation. A hungry journalist seeking a trauma narrative follows, which she neutralizes just as swiftly. This shift highlights a critical defensive strategy. True recovery demands entirely severing the lines of toxic communication, rather than merely silencing them. The third recording introduces a cold, litigious threat into her sanctuary. Grant's attorney attempts to fabricate a narrative of coerced testimony, aggressively demanding a deposition. Exhibiting remarkable emotional regulation, Celine deletes the audio without a physiological spike. The blinding panic has exhausted her adrenal system, replacing it with a thick, dissociative numbness. She wanders the grand estate like a detached entity, drifting through the mahogany library and vacant corridors. The environment lacks genuine human warmth. It is a monument to a narcissist, too consumed by violent acquisitions to form a real home. It highlights a recurring clinical blind spot. Emotional dissociation provides an excellent temporary shield, but it completely fails to neutralize the predator's actively hunting you in the shadows. Let us observe together how Luca masterfully accelerates her isolation. He emerges from the shadows, dropping a heavy envelope onto the table. Celine's heart rate spikes as he spreads surveillance photographs across the wood. The initial images document Grant stalking her previous locations. The third photograph, however, initiates a severe trauma response. Grant is conversing with a sharply dressed individual. Luca clinically identifies the man as Vincent Castellano, a highly lethal operative for Chicago organized crime. The evidence proves her former abuser is now conspiring with syndicate enforcers. Listen carefully to this unyielding reality. Your unresolved history will inevitably track you down, often returning with far greater resources and a terrifying new level of sophistication. Luca taps the glossy image, identifying the man as Marco Santini, an apex predator in the loan shark hierarchy. Celine experiences acute vertigo as her reality destabilizes. Why is her former partner engaging with violent sociopaths? Luca delivers the final psychological blow. Grant is drowning in a $200,000 illicit gambling deficit. He had systematically drained their shared finances for a year. When Celine established independence, the capital flow died. Now Santini requires a violent collection. When Celine questions his intelligence network, Luca's eyes turn cold, stating that mastering dark information is his survival mechanism. The behavioral lesson here is exact. Maintaining any financial tether to a parasite will ultimately drag you into their lethal consequences. The psychological pressure intensifies as Luca presents a massive intelligence dossier. Celine reviews the documentation, her breath catching at the terrifying scope of their surveillance. The syndicate possesses her complete daily matrix, transit routes, secure locations, financial data. In the behavioral economy of the Mafia, she is simply a high-value asset used to control Grant. She paces the room, demanding to know why he withheld this fatal data. Luca employs a classic narcissistic justification, stating her nervous system was too fragile yesterday. Evading a crisis never neutralizes the threat. It merely allows the pathology to mutate. Trembling, she asks for his intervention strategy. Luca coldly vows to engage the loan shark directly and erase her debt using his own illicit capital. Celine abruptly pivots, her analytical mind correctly identifying the manipulation. $200,000 is a massive sum, and she demands his true transactional price. She understands the fundamental law of sociopathic environments. Predators do not operate as charities. Luca encroaches into her personal space, elevating the tension. He maintains unbroken eye contact, murmuring that his singular demand is her permanent safety. He claims he wants her free from hypervigilance forever. Stunned by this aggressive protection, she questions his underlying motive. Luca softly replies that her existence warrants his violent defense. The trauma bond begins to solidify instantly. It is a haunting psychological paradox. Occasionally, the most lethal individuals are the only ones capable of validating your true worth. As her defensive barriers actively disintegrate, a phone call shatters the quiet.
The screen displays an untraceable origin, and she commits a critical tactical error by accepting the connection.
Let this serve as an absolute behavioral rule. When an unidentified threat initiates contact, sever the line immediately. A calm voice infiltrates her ear, establishing dominance by confirming her coordinates. He weaponizes Grant's name, noting the syndicate has zero interest in their domestic history. They simply require their missing capital. Celine attempts to rationalize us, but the predator shuts her down. The deficit is now $230,000. She has exactly 7 days to yield half, or they will extract the value from her physical anatomy. Her entire nervous system completely freezes. Luca aggressively seizes the device from Celine's paralyzed hands. He archives the numeric sequence, immediately dispatching orders for a digital trace. His tone sharpens into an absolute command, directing her to gather her belongings. As cortisol floods her system, she tearfully confronts his failure to maintain her security. Luca's jaw hardens, issuing a brutal admission of his own tactical error. When a megalomaniac admits fault, you and I know the threat matrix is critical. Soon, an armored motorcade accelerates down the frozen highway. Luca grips the steering wheel, aggressively coordinating logistics in rapid Italian. Celine remains catatonic, $230,000 of violent debt, staring into the void. She softly begs to know exactly what fresh hell they are speeding toward in the dark. Let us open this clinical case file and examine the dynamic. The dashboard illuminates Luca's features, casting him as the architect of her isolation. They are fleeing to a remote Michigan compound, completely severed from society. He vows to remain in exile until he eradicates the predators hunting her. Observe Celine studying his profile. This syndicate leader has dismantled her reality, yet hoards her like a priceless artifact. The cognitive dissonance finally shatters her composure. She demands autonomy, knowing true independence requires carrying the crushing weight of your own trauma. The megalomaniacal narcissist merely tightens his grip on the wheel. His voice splinters as he makes a terrifying confession of affection. He loathes the terror in her eyes because it challenges his absolute control. The sociopath is marching to war. The subject's low voice pierces the psychological vacuum of the cabin. He clinically rejects the notion of abandoning her over a debt she never incurred. His focus remains locked on the icy road as he murmurs his twisted philosophy on loyalty. Celine attempts to construct defensive emotional boundaries, questioning the consequences of rejecting his custody. A microscopic smirk betrays his narcissistic confidence. The window for escape has closed. The vehicle penetrates the dark perimeter of the forest, arriving at a seemingly primitive structure. Do not misinterpret the aesthetic. It is a paranoid architectural marvel, fortified by heavy generators and encrypted satellite networks. His underworld infrastructure reinforces a devastating psychological truth. When an apex predator shields you from an oncoming catastrophe, the victim inevitably clings to the predator. Notice the behavioral conditioning at play. The hearth casts erratic illumination as Luca mandates her rest. He establishes a perimeter by the glass, an obsessive sentinel denying himself sleep until dawn. Encased in thermal layers, Celine suppresses a vocalized panic response. She observes her normative existence disintegrating. Yet, within that frigid enclosure, a profound pathology germinates. We are observing the onset of Stockholm Syndrome. Luca is a master manipulator, but he is currently her sole barrier against annihilation. The human psyche is terrifyingly adaptable, often forging trauma bonds with the exact danger it should flee. 72 agonizing hours dissolve within this isolation chamber. Celine remains passive, observing his physical agitation as his modulated tones authorize brutal executions over a secure frequency. The popping embers punctuate the silence. Celine feigns cognitive engagement with a text, secretly processing the lethality of Luca's directives. He operates a massive criminal syndicate from total geographical isolation. As dawn penetrates the frost, a sudden transmission fractures the tranquility. Luca absorbs the data, and we observe an acute physiological reaction. Grant has breached containment. Her former partner corrupted a guard and vanished. From a behavioral analysis standpoint, a cornered man devoid of viable options is the most lethal organism in existence. Celine exhibits respiratory distress, questioning their tactical future. Luca mandates her continued confinement while he sanitizes the urban environment. However, her motor tremors suddenly cease. The victim is fundamentally transitioning. She refuses to remain a passive subject in this trauma cycle. Let us analyze this critical pivot in her development. Celine closes the distance, forcing direct ocular engagement with her captor. Her vocal cords betray anxiety, but her resolve is solidifying. She actively rejects his role as her violent proxy. If this sociopathic environment is her new baseline, she must confront it directly. This illustrates a harsh clinical reality avoidance behaviors inevitably fail. The psyche must eventually mount a defense. Luca evaluates her, his narcissistic armor fracturing to expose genuine respect. He warns that this threshold destroys her innocence. She exhibits zero hesitation. Minutes later, their vehicle accelerates toward the brutal infrastructure of Milwaukee. Luca monitors his device in silence. Grant is systematically dismantling her previous attachments, leaving a scorched earth to force a confrontation. The ex-partner exhibits the predatory tracking patterns of a starved canine. Upon infiltrating Luca's corporate facade, the atmospheric pressure shifts. The structure operates as a secure facility, manned by enforcers masquerading as corporate assets. Luca isolates her within the executive suite, positioning the urban sprawl below as a detached grid. He issues a rigid command for immobility. The retrieval of the firearm is a highly symbolic transfer of power. He presents the weapon with a total absence of emotional affect. His instruction is binary. If an unverified entity breaches the perimeter, she must execute lethal force. Here is the paradox of survival psychology. When a psychopath offers the instrument of your salvation, the mind compels you to accept it. Yet, Celine experiences acute catatonia, her dilated pupils fixated entirely upon the dormant weapon. Celine exhibits severe verbal disfluency and motor tremors as she admits her lack of firearms training. Luca terminates her panic with an authoritative gesture. His visual presentation is entirely devoid of empathy. If the hostile subject breaches the perimeter, cognitive hesitation ensures mortality. The preservation of life enforces a brutal, psychiatric reality the ego must aggressively mutate into whatever the trauma demands when previous coping mechanisms are incinerated. Luca exits, subjecting her to a profoundly dysregulating void. She collapses, mourning the predictable baseline she once possessed. Abruptly, digital illumination fractures the darkness. A message from her captor confirms the hostile is inside, followed by a second text target secured. Before her respiratory rate can stabilize, the heavy acoustic signature of approaching footsteps reverberates outside. Observe the power dynamics in this collision. The door swings inward, and the megalomaniac's silhouette eclipses the light. Operatives deposit Grant onto the floor. Celine experiences an acute physiological reaction. The architect of her initial trauma is now a degraded shell, yet Grant manifests his signature psychopathic grin. He locks onto her, delivering a toxic verbal stimulus. Let this serve as a clinical axiom. Never permit a malignant ghost from your past to express amusement while surveying the wreckage they caused. Luca dismisses his enforcers. Grant instantly deploys a pathetic victim-playing strategy. Luca analyzes him with deadened affect, announcing the termination of his timeline. Grant responds with manic laughter, demanding to know if this syndicate apex predator is actually her benevolent protector. We are witnessing the complete fragmentation of Celine's reality. Grant establishes intense eye contact, violently dismantling her cognitive dissonance. He weaponizes the data. Luca is the neurological center of the city's corruption. The judicial and law enforcement apparatuses are merely appendages he controls. Celine white-knuckles the desk, using denial as a defense against Grant's historic pathological lying. But the antagonist merely smiles, driving the psychological scalpel deeper. He points at the kingpin and delivers the ultimate paradigm shift. Luca was never her trauma shield. He was the primary manipulator, her idealized employment. She has been functioning as a financial laundering node for the syndicate. Observe this devastating truth. When a frictionless solution magically resolves a crisis, the subject is always indentured to a catastrophic hidden deficit. The trauma of the revelation induces immediate neurological shock. Her visual field distorts into a dissociative blur. She redirects her focus to the narcissist, broadcasting a desperate plea for reality maintenance. She silently begs him to invalidate the accusations. Yet, the mob boss remains paralyzed, displaying flat affect. We must acknowledge a brutal behavioral metric. Here, absolute silence is the most structurally sound confession an apex predator can provide. Grant absorbs her psychological hemorrhage with sadistic amusement, detailing the fraudulent transactions she executed. She was a sterile vessel for the syndicate's pathology. Celine experiences acute respiratory distress. She elevates a trembling hand, her voice fracturing as she establishes a rigid boundary, prohibiting further spatial engagement. The magnitude of this calculated manipulation has fundamentally cleaved her psyche. Her psychological infrastructure finally collapses. Celine propels herself toward the workstation, securing the firearm. She pivots, targeting the figure she previously misidentified as her savior. Temporal perception distorts. Luca initiates a slow elevation of his hands, attempting to verbally de-escalate the threat. But her profound emotional crash has mutated into hyper-aroused hostility. She transferred her autonomy to him, and he weaponized her. It is an excruciating clinical observation. The architects who design your sanctuary are frequently the engineers welding the bars of your psychiatric prison. The weapon oscillates violently in her grip. Ultimately, the narcissist vocalizes his motive. He regarded it a pristine anomaly, that authorities would ignore. She was entirely a calculated mark. Those sterile, sociopathic data points permanently terminate her emotional baseline, finalizing her complete psychological break. Step into this cold room with me and let us examine the catastrophic failure of a mastermind. She was initially a negligible variable in his matrix, but observe Luca's current state. The rigid sociopathic defenses fortifying his psyche fracture. He verbalizes a critical deviation. Celine has become his sole authentic attachment. She processes his statement as another manipulative distortion. Before he can exhale, Grant initiates a sudden kinetic assault. He seizes her wrist, applying a grotesque rotational force. A deafening ballistic discharge ruptures the acoustic environment. Celine is paralyzed by shock, registering the arterial spread across the pristine textiles. Luca slowly collapses to his knees. The disorganized antagonist has neutralized the apex predator. The final analysis is irrefutable, regardless of how meticulously you calculate the variables. Raw emotion will invariably function as the mechanism of your destruction. We observe the acute stress response in real time. Celine is paralyzed in a waking nightmare, her psychological defenses shattering as the dark blood ruins the silk rug. Grant stands rigid, staring at the smoking steel in his hand. He is completely detached from the catastrophic trauma he just triggered. A few feet away, the criminal subject, Luca, loses his color but none of his control. His massive hand suppresses the wound, yet he never screams. He anchors himself on the floor, locking his dark eyes onto Grant with the freezing calm of an apex predator. It is a textbook display of pathological dominance. The lesson here is deeply unsettling. The most dangerous threat in a room full of absolute chaos is always the man who completely refuses to panic. Watch the psychological collapse of a fractured man. Grant stumbles backward, his voice cracking as he rationalizes the gunshot as a mere accident. It is the hollow defense mechanism of a coward avoiding consequence. Luca breathes heavily through the pain, drenched in sweat. Yet, his megalomaniac narcissism remains fully intact, promising that his empire will erase Grant from human memory. Backed into a corner, Grant points his weapon at Celine, weeping about the flawless life they supposedly had. But Celine finally breaks her conditioning. Her voice is clinically cold as she shatters his pathetic illusion, stating they were never happy. The truth we must face is undeniable. Nostalgia is very often just a beautifully dressed lie we tell ourselves to avoid the crushing pain of reality. You and I have seen what happens when toxic secrets fester in the human mind. Celine unleashes years of repressed agony. Her voice breaks as she exposes the cycle of abuse, cataloging every hidden bruise Grant forced upon her. Grant grips his weapon until his knuckles turn white, aggressively projecting blame. But the fatal psychological strike comes from the bleeding mobster. Demonstrating severe antisocial traits, Luca confesses he used Celine because her pristine record made a perfect legal shield. The weight of that double betrayal hollows her out entirely. Yet, Luca insists she needs this brutal reality over her comfortable illusion. We all learn this painful lesson eventually. The truth rarely brings immediate peace, but instead leaves an aching scar we must slowly learn to carry. The kingpin is rapidly losing blood, but his narcissistic drive refuses to let silence win. Luca rationalizes his actions, claiming that watching Celine wither under a domestic tyrant was a tragedy he could not ignore. His crimes were merely an excuse to pull her into his orbit. Before that twisted revelation can settle, Grant experiences a total psychotic break and yanks the trigger. A deafening crack shatters the room as plaster rains down, the wild bullet missing the mobster by inches. Grant howls in uninhibited madness. Suddenly, the massive oak doors violently burst inward as armed guards flood the room, screaming commands. Let this be a clear lesson to remember. When you push a desperate man into a dark corner, he will always reveal the terrifying monster hiding just beneath his skin. Luca attempts to force his broken frame upward, but his failing biology betrays his commanding will. He stares Grant down with the freezing eyes of a predator, delivering a final ultimatum to drop the weapon. But a fractured mind always chooses the darkest path. Grant yanks Celine backward, jamming the cold steel directly against her temple. Panic floods her nervous system, drowning out everything except the scent of her abuser's severe desperation. Celine looks past her captor and locks onto Luca. The untouchable megalomaniac has vanished. In his place sits a terrified, bleeding man, watching his chosen obsession slip away. It is a profound lesson about the human condition. True devotion is the exact psychological force that strips away our heavy armor and leaves us entirely powerless. The environment grows heavy with the scent of approaching death. Luca issues a clinical order for Grant to release his hostage. But the broken man is detached from reality, pressing the muzzle hard into her skin. He barks out a grandiose delusion, demanding a secure vehicle and a fortune. Luca dissects this fantasy with cold logic, promising Grant will be a corpse before the elevator doors open. Grant howls like a cornered animal, swearing to drag everyone to the grave. Then, employing a masterful psychological pivot, Luca quietly orders his men to lower their rifles. Grant erupts into maniacal laughter, fully believing his dominant delusion has won. But remember this crucial life lesson. Extreme arrogance will always blind a man to the fatal trap, snapping shut directly beneath his own feet. Stick with me here, because the psychology of survival is terrifying. Celine keeps her dilated eyes locked on the mobster. Then a microscopic behavioral shift occurs. Luca's gaze darts to her right arm for a fraction of a second. It is a silent language, and her survival instinct translates it instantly. Twisting her body with violent fury, Celine drives a brutal elbow straight into her abuser's ribs. The air escapes Grant in a ragged gasp. His weapon wavers, and she throws herself to the floor. 3 deafening gunshots rip through the room. Curled tight, she braces for impact, but only a ringing silence follows. She lifts her head to find Grant motionless and permanently ruined. The lesson here is profound. Sometimes the absolute truest form of protection is delivered without making a single sound. His voice reduced to a whisper, the kingpin orders his men to summon the trauma team. Celine drags herself across the carpet to observe the man who cast a toxic pathology over her life. Grant gasps out a manipulative claim that he always loved her. But her psychological conditioning is completely broken. She analyzes him coldly, delivering a freezing truth. He never loved her. He only loved the absolute control he held over her spirit. We must never confuse a captor's narcissistic obsession with genuine human devotion. Grant searches her hollow eyes, asking if this is the end. She gives him an unforgiving confirmation. As his biological functions cease, a profound revelation hits her. The trauma bonds are finally severed, but instead of sweet triumph, she feels absolutely nothing at all. In the sterile quiet, the untouchable narcissist surrenders to extreme blood loss, sliding down the wall. Celine scrambles to his side, her emotional numbness instantly replaced by a fierce, panicked attachment. She presses her hands deeply into his wound, terrified of her dominant protector slipping away. Even through the severe physical trauma, a calculated smile touches his pale lips. He whispers a quiet assurance that he will survive. Suddenly, a private medical extraction team bursts through the doors. They aggressively shove her aside, packing the wound with clinical precision. Shouting about the internal bullet, they prepare to extract his failing body. The lesson here is brutally unforgiving. Biological reality waits for absolutely no one when death is finally standing in the room. The aftermath is a clinical blur of elevated heart rates and shouting. As the medics secure his failing body, this hardened megalomaniac executes his most brilliant psychological manipulation. Defying his physical limits, Luca forces his bloody hand outward. With his final breath, he offers her the illusion of choice, whispering she is free to run from his criminal pathology. But Celine firmly grips his hand, fully cementing her Stockholm syndrome by promising she will stay. Listen closely to this behavioral truth. The most unbreakable psychological chains are the ones we willingly lock around our own wrists. They rush him to an underground clinic. Hours drag by in that sterile waiting room, where she sits entirely consumed by the dried crimson caked beneath her own fingernails. Sitting isolated under the fluorescent glare, Celine exhibits signs of acute psychological fracture. A hysterical laugh escapes her throat as her brain processes her reality. Her previous abuser is dead, while the apex predator she is now dependent upon fights for survival. The cognitive dissonance is suffocating. Suddenly, a quiet nurse approaches, interrupting the cycle of dread. Celine's pulse stops. Against all probability, the projectile missed his vital organs. The mobster will survive. The invisible, psychological weight crushing her ribs vanishes, leaving her completely devoted. Let me tell you something vital. Sometimes the most agonizing trial we endure is simply sitting still in the hollow aftermath, waiting for the severe trauma to finally settle. The clinical observation continues in the gloom of the intensive care ward. Luca lies anchored to a symphony of sterile monitors. Every sharp beep is a stubborn biological reminder that the megalomaniac refuses to expire. Beside him, Celine pulls a metal chair across the cold floor. She takes his hand, her mind rationally dissecting the beginning of their bond. She recognizes the intoxicating illusion of his protection. Every tender interaction was a highly calculated move on his dark psychological chessboard. You and I must analyze this objectively. You can never build a stable human foundation on the architecture of beautiful lies, no matter how desperately your traumatized brain aches for the fantasy. Celine finally stops repressing the bitter, clinical truth of her willing captivity. In the suffocating quiet, a terrifying cognitive epiphany washes over our subject. Celine feels a profound attachment toward this shattered criminal. Against every logical survival instinct, she is irreversibly trauma-bonded to the exact narcissist who manipulated her like a pawn. Before that tragedy settles, the door swings open. Margaret, the syndicate's attorney, enters with the dead eyes of a sociopath. She coldly lists the collateral damage and the extensive paper trail, explicitly framing Celine. The authorities are ready to bury her. The lesson hanging in the sterile air is unforgiving. Always calculate the hidden psychological cost of a savior's protection before you surrender your autonomy. Celine feels her knees buckle as the invisible steel bars of her shiny new cage permanently lock into place. Celine exhibits acute trauma as pure panic overrides her nervous system. She stammers her innocence regarding the blood money, but Margaret coldly silences her. Ignorance never prevents a prison sentence. Then, the attorney introduces a variable that suffocates the room. She can make the forensic evidence completely vanish. Before surgery, Luca issued a final directive to construct an absolute fortress around Celine. The kingpin is prepared to incinerate his syndicate just to maintain his grip on her. Let us carefully observe this human pathology. True devotion is rarely found in simple gestures. It is the terrifying, obsessive choice to destroy your own world to keep another person safe. Celine shakes uncontrollably, begging for a way out. Margaret simply stares right through her, ordering the broken subject to step aside. Margaret lingers at the door, dropping a heavy psychological weight. The syndicate has already executed a masterclass in cognitive distortion. The bloody shootout has been erased, repackaged to the public as a tragic suicide. Physical nauseas hit Celine instantly. The fabrication gaslights the horrific reality she barely survived. Margaret offers a sociopathic smirk, welcoming her to an environment where objective truth is highly malleable. Today, you and I are going to unpack this dynamic together. The narrative is never authored by the righteous. It is dictated entirely by whoever holds the most power. As the lawyer walks away, Celine drowns in her own guilt. 3 hours evaporate in dead silence. Then, A raw, primal groan echoes from the sterile bed. The apex predator has finally awakened. Luca stares at the ceiling with a flat affect. His jaw locks as the fresh wound burns. Celine whispers his name, her voice showing acute distress. He shifts his predatory gaze, calculating why her flight response failed. She insists she honors her promises. He verifies the termination of his rival, responding with cold satisfaction. When she challenges the fake suicide narrative, he applies strict sociopathic logic. The truth guarantees a cage, so he perpetually selects the lie. We must accept a grim behavioral reality here. The boundary separating a victim from a villain is frequently just the brutal arithmetic of survival, but the psychological bill always comes due. Celine glares at the broken man, her eyes burning with pure anger. You used me. You lied to me. The clinical tension is suffocating. Celine releases her suppressed hostility, explaining how his manipulation fractured her identity. Displaying textbook megalomania, Luca remains unflinching. He prefers her corrupted and alive over pristine and deceased. Suddenly, her psychological defenses collapse. She admits she should abandon him, yet her trauma bond paralyzes her. Beneath his antisocial behavior, he validated her existence when society ignored her. Then comes the inevitable manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome. She confesses her romantic attachment to her captor. Luca is left functionally mute. Consider this heavy lesson. Often, the dangerous individuals who drag you into the deepest shadows are the only ones who actually validate your fundamental worth. A megalomaniac never absorbs a strike without returning fire. Luca matches her emotional dysregulation, displaying severe vulnerability. Observing her primal survival instincts completely dismantled his cognitive barriers. He admits he would execute every deception again to ensure her survival. Attempting to sit up, acute somatic pain forces him back down. He clinically validates her formidable resilience, noting how she rejects subjugation even from him. He demonstrates rare self-awareness, acknowledging he is a predator she should flee. You and I must examine this dynamic. Authentic connection is never sterile. It requires integrating the darkest fragments of your psyche and fiercely protecting the one catalyst that compels you to be a better human being. The neutralized predator subtly manipulates his subject, requiring her active consent to stay. Celine evaluates the architect of her psychological destruction. Every evolutionary survival mechanism commands her to evacuate this hostile environment. Instead, cognitive dissonance takes control. She leans in, pressing her mouth to his. Retreating, the narcissist deploys a testing smirk, probing if their trauma bond is fully solidified. Celine maintains a cold affect, issuing a conditional affirmative to ensure he registers her lingering rage. This highlights a critical behavioral paradox. Occasionally, you must temporarily suppress your justified anger to properly process your underlying emotional compulsions, even when your entire reality remains fundamentally compromised. Celine refuses to let neurochemical attachment override his sociopathic history, establishing a rigid boundary. A single deception, and she initiates permanent extraction. Luca utilizes his dark charisma to guarantee total transparency. 4 days later, the megalomaniac discharges himself from medical supervision early. His syndicate relocates him to a secure penthouse, as his office remains biologically contaminated. Celine advises physical recovery, but he immediately resumes dictating fatal directives over the phone. It illustrates a fundamental psychological metric. Constructing an authentic foundation of trust requires longitudinal behavioral consistency. Manipulative verbal assurances whispered during moments of vulnerability hold absolutely zero value. Suppressed stress triggers a severe confrontation. Celine asserts biological survival must be his singular objective. Luca exhibits textbook denial, minimizing a lethal ballistic injury to maintain his grandiose self-image. Celine counteracts with pure hostility, generating enough pressure to force the predator back into his seat. Breaking visual contact briefly, she finds him micromanaging his network on the phone while suppressing pain. She issues an authoritative command to terminate the call. Her newly discovered dominance overrides his conditioning, and he actually complies. Let us analyze this critical juncture. A healthier psychological baseline cannot be achieved if you continuously utilize chaotic distractions to evade highly uncomfortable conversations. Celine solidifies her stance, signaling a shift in her psychological framework. Survival is no longer sufficient. She demands a clinical definition of their dysfunctional trauma bond. The megalomaniac defaults to silence, reflecting the inquiry back onto her. Admitting to cognitive disorientation, his aggressive exterior de-escalates. He proposes a simplified behavioral approach. They will regulate breathing and eliminate future projections. Celine evaluates the architect of her crisis. She accepts this but establishes an impenetrable psychological perimeter. One additional manipulation guarantees her permanent extraction. You and I must recognize the clinical necessity here. Constructing rigid boundaries is never a selfish act. It is the only mechanism available to preserve your sanity in an unstable environment. Enduring severe somatic distress, the predator initiates a verbal contract. Luca pledges his remaining timeline to atoning for his antisocial transgressions. He guarantees transparency, offering the autonomy he previously extracted. His presentation indicates genuine cognitive restructuring. Celine registers a decrease in nervous system arousal, choosing to validate his assertions. 14 days elapse. As the patient rehabilitates, Celine executes a massive behavioral shift. She transitions from passive hostage into the executive of his legitimate infrastructure. She deduces that managing an illicit syndicate mirrors corporate logistics. Simply utilizing lethal enforcement, we must carefully code this psychological phenomenon. Often, being violently expelled from your operational baseline is the only catalyst capable of revealing the formidable cognitive strength you possess. You and I are intimately familiar with the physiological dread preceding an environmental collapse. Margaret now functions as their primary institutional defense mechanism. The sociopathic attorney operates with clinical efficiency, deploying legal documents onto the table. She initiates a fear-based conditioning tactic, warning Celine that federal incarceration remains highly probable. Maintain close proximity to the narcissist, Margaret dictates, and your legal immunity is guaranteed. It is an irrational concept in this violent environment, yet, when federal investigators attempt to breach the perimeter, Margaret intercepts them, utilizing complex litigation threats to completely repel the raid. This reinforces a critical sociological metric. Biological survival frequently depends less on your internal resilience and more on the highly specialized proxies you strategically position to guard your flanks. The bedroom generates a dangerous illusion of psychological homeostasis. Their synchronized respiration briefly mimics actual neurological stability. At 3 in the morning, an incoming transmission violently disrupts the simulation. Celine experiences an acute startle response. Luca sits up, his muscular system tightening. He processes the tactical report, clinically requesting mortality metrics before terminating the connection. A rival faction has incinerated a strategic asset, terminating 3 subjects. In this antisocial framework, narcissistic injury is aggressively compensated with destruction. Suppressing severe physical pain, Luca prepares to reassert his dominance. Celine exhibits attachment anxiety, begging to accompany him. He issues a cold command for her to remain securely contained. This exposes the fundamental flaw in their experiment. You cannot logically engineer a secure psychological sanctuary when the foundational structure is perpetually combusting. We are examining Celine during a profound psychological shift. Standing barefoot on the cold floor, she locks eyes with Luca. Clinically, her civilian ego is dissolving. She states he no longer dictates her fate. He reacts with intense emotional dependence, swearing that if she falls in this mafia warfare, the guilt will fracture his psyche before storming out. Left alone, her nervous system triggers an adrenaline dump. Yet, instead of weeping, she grips the heavy steel pistol. Its cold weight acts as a grounding mechanism against the terror. She drives into the desolate morning, smoke bleeding into the dawn. This offers a simple life lesson. Discovering your true resilience often means walking directly into the flames, allowing the weakest parts of your identity to burn away forever. The morning sun struggles to penetrate the smoke of the ruined criminal empire. Celine locates Luca near the blistering heat. The violent orange glow reflects in his hollow eyes, a manifestation of severe psychological trauma. She steps beside him, refusing to make eye contact. His voice raspy with ash, he states he ordered her to stay hidden. Celine elevates her chin, establishing a new behavioral baseline, and reminds him her days of being treated like fragile glass are over. He warns her this path leads to an early grave, but her emotional affect remains entirely flat. He pulled her into this nightmare, and she refuses to regress. This highlights a simple life lesson. Genuine loyalty requires us to stand firmly beside the people we care about, even when they are navigating their most terrifying battlefields. You and I need to pause here because this behavioral shift is fascinating. Luca stands in the suffocating heat, asking if she comprehends the finality of her choice. There is no returning to a normal life. Celine never breaks eye contact. The firelight illuminates her face as she states her old identity died the second she made that fateful call. Luca analyzes the psychological scarring taking root in her mind and slowly nods. She is now part of the pathology. Turning to the Inferno, he outlines his calculated obsession with Santini. They must dismantle the narcissistic kingpin who raised him, obliterating his criminal syndicate piece by piece. It illustrates a simple life lesson. The raging fires we ignite to destroy those who hurt us are often the very same flames that end up scorching our own humanity. If the aging kingpin chooses the grave, Luca murmurs with suppressed grief, they will gladly dig it. The hollowed warehouse collapses with a deafening roar, sending orange embers into the sky. Celine observes this destruction as a cognitive turning point. She watches the final bridge to her innocent past turn to ash. Clinically, she is no longer the traumatized victim. Her posture is rigid, hardened into an unforgiving defense mechanism. As the pale sun bleeds over the skyline, a chilling smile breaks across her face. Her panic response is entirely gone, replaced by a cold appetite for chaos. This psychological pivot teaches us a simple life lesson. Fear only maintains its paralyzing grip on your mind until you finally decide to reach up and claim your own internal authority. And just like that, the systematic dismantling of the syndicate begins. A sprawling criminal empire does not collapse instantly. It suffers a slow and systematic exsanguination. Celine sits still in the suffocating shadows of cigar-filled back rooms, clinically observing the behavioral codes of damaged enforcers. Night after night, she tracks illicit funds through complex ledgers, her pen methodically severing her remaining moral tethers. She abandoned the obsessive urge to scrub the invisible guilt from her hands weeks ago. This behavioral adaptation proves a simple life lesson. We must always lie in the psychological beds we construct for ourselves, no matter how cold and isolating they eventually become. 3 tense weeks vanish into this routine. Finally, Luca identifies the primary vulnerability. The Kingpin's operational heart is a massive logistics hub on the south side, hiding in plain sight. The dim light casts severe shadows over the workspace. Luca studies the blueprints like a patient fixating on his own trauma. He takes every manipulative tactic the narcissistic Kingpin taught him and weaponizes it. They will infiltrate the compound at 4 in the morning. Celine observes the microexpressions in his jaw. She analyzes his hollow stare and asks the necessary question: why actively provoke the father figure to retaliate? Luca traces a line, exhibiting classic emotional detachment. A desperate man, he whispers, will always make a fatal cognitive error. This highlights a simple life lesson. The most accurate way to uncover someone's true nature is to push them to the absolute edge of their limits. Celine knows she should feel moral revulsion, yet her baseline heart rate remains disturbingly steady. Clinically speaking, Celine is experiencing profound emotional blunting. She methodically buttons her coat, asking Luca for the deployment time. He pauses, projecting his own guilt, questioning if she is psychologically prepared for the violence. She closes the distance, eye contact unbroken, stating she understands exactly the moral debt she owes. He scans her facial markers for hesitation, but the traumatized victim is entirely erased. He agrees, his tone hardening, instructing her to maintain a peripheral position. This illustrates a simple life lesson. Once you fully accept the heavy consequences of your actions, the paralyzing anxiety simply evaporates. By 3:30 in the morning, the city is a void. Celine rides passenger, the heavy tactical vest pressing against her sternum as the fortress emerges from the fog. The target location is a fortified structure. Sweeping surveillance and floodlights create an artificial daylight environment. Yet Luca utilizes specialized personnel. A cyber operative isolates the video network, keeping the exterior lighting active to avoid triggering the guards' situational awareness. Using blind spots, the team breaches the perimeter fence, moving with synchronized precision. Inside, the logistical volume of the Kingpin's operation is staggering. Massive crates dominate the visual field, the air thick with diesel exhaust. This serves as a simple life lesson. Your survival often depends on your ability to regulate your breathing within the toxic environments constructed by others. Luca signals with a gloved hand, and the squad disperses into the freezing gloom toward the vault. Stick with me here, because we are entering a critical phase. Celine shadows Luca, navigating the cavernous interior. They locate the primary asset within a heavy steel enclosure. An enforcer applies hydraulic cutters. The metal fracture is acoustically masked by the ambient generator hum. The breach reveals a staggering cache of narcotics, the chemical currency used to exploit vulnerable minds. This highlights a simple life lesson about pathological greed. Narcissistic individuals will gladly construct their golden empires upon the silent suffering of others. Luca stares at the illicit capital that funded his childhood, methodically documenting the evidence for a buyer. He issues a brief radio command for the transport vehicles. Then, they hold their positions in the dark, monitoring their own elevated respiratory rates. The sensory isolation ends when 3 transport vehicles breach the bay, headlights cutting the darkness. Luca's syndicate functions with high efficiency, extracting the inventory. Celine maintains a defensive posture by the doors, displaying signs of acute stress vasoconstriction in her hands and an elevated pulse. This volatile reality proves a simple life lesson. The most dangerous variables often manifest exactly when your cognitive focus is directed elsewhere. An auditory cue disrupts the baseline. A solitary guard emerges from a blind spot, exhibiting severe physiological tremors while holding a firearm. Celine instantly targets his center of mass, issuing a firm verbal command to halt. The guard's motor control degrades immediately. He whispers frantically that he is merely low-level labor trying to survive his shift. Overhead lighting illuminates the panic on the guard's face. He is caught in a double bind, stating the cartel will execute him for this failure. Celine's affect remains rigidly detached. She articulates a clear threat. Activating his radio results in immediate termination. Behind her, the extraction concludes. Then, the subject attempts an emotional appeal, referencing his 2 children. The mention of family breaks through Celine's dissociative state. You and I should note a simple life lesson here. Authentic power is not defined by the damage you inflict, but by the fragile lives you deliberately choose to spare. Her firearm lowers a fraction. She instructs him to prioritize his family, abandon the weapon, and evacuate. He complies, fleeing into the fog. Luca emerges, analyzes the discarded radio, and acknowledges her calculated mercy with a nod. Luca could have eliminated the variable, but he accepts her behavioral intervention. The unit initiates a rapid exfiltration, vehicles breaking the perimeter and vanishing into the urban grid. Law enforcement secures the scene too late, finding only forensic evidence. This escalation proves a simple life lesson. If you force a desperate individual into a psychological corner, you must be prepared to endure their unrestrained retaliation. 48 hours later, the narcissistic kingpin issues his countermeasure. An explosive device destroys the facade of Luca's primary business. There are no casualties, but the psychological message is absolute. Luca exhibits zero outward distress. Battling the surrogate father who molded his pathology, he retaliates by incinerating a rival distribution center. Both subjects are now entirely consumed by a mutual, catastrophic loop of destruction. Let us examine Celine's condition together. Her nervous system is entirely rewired by chronic paranoia, trapped in a state of severe hypervigilance, where a settling floorboard mimics a gravedigger's boot. There is a simple, meaningful life lesson here. Existing purely on borrowed time will inevitably erode your psychological core. Their fragile illusion of safety shatters on a mundane Tuesday. When Luca answers his disposable phone, autonomic shock drains the blood from his face. The patriarch, the megalomaniacal narcissist who systematically forged him into a weapon, has located their sanctuary. Luca barks a single command. 10 minutes later, rubber screams against the pavement as they flee, abandoning their sanctuary. Luca strangles the steering wheel, his knuckles bone white as he weaves through traffic. Clinically, he exhibits the fugue state of a man outrunning his own trauma. He mutters about a secluded cabin, but the micro-tremors in his voice betray his terror. Consider this simple, meaningful life lesson. There is no physical refuge when the narcissist who shaped your reality decides your existence must end. Past the city limits, a dark sedan materializes in the mirror. Stick with me as we watch this psychological nightmare unfold. Luca screams a warning and buries the accelerator. The engine roars past 100 miles per hour. Yet, a second vehicle glides to their side, its dark window lowering to reveal the emotionless executioner within. The metallic gleam of a firearm breaches the morning air, a jarring intrusion into their desperate flight. Luca orders Celine to the floorboards. Milliseconds later, a projectile shatters the rear window, coating her in fragmented glass. A second round violently penetrates the frame, missing her skull by millimeters. Tires screech as Luca whips the vehicle onto a narrow side street. We must observe this simple, meaningful life lesson. The pathological consequences of a violent history will never knock politely, nor will they spare the innocent collateral damage around you. The heavy pursuit vehicle rapidly closes the gap, discharging rounds into their mirrors. Triggered by a raw fight-or-flight response, Luca violently crushes the brake pedal. The vehicle violently rotates across the asphalt in a deliberate skid. The pursuing driver, bound by normal human reaction time, has 0 seconds to correct. They slam into Luca's bumper with a deafening rupture of metal. Celine absorbs the kinetic shockwave right as the airbags detonate, filling the cabin with harsh chemical powder. Note this simple, meaningful life lesson. Sometimes a victim must deliberately engineer a catastrophic collision to shatter the momentum of their abuser. Before the neurological ringing fades, Luca drags her from the smoking chassis. They flee under the acute stress response of hunted prey. Behind them, concussed enforcers emerge from the twisted steel. But the trauma-bonded pair are already vaulting a weathered wooden fence. Stepping into the chaotic flow of traffic, Luca aims his weapon at a passing transport truck. He forces the driver to flee, aggressively securing their extraction. He pushes Celine inside and accelerates, leaving the area drowning in a chorus of emergency sirens. They travel in complete silence for 20 minutes before abandoning the stolen machine in an overgrown lot. The sudden sensory deprivation is deeply unsettling. There is a simple, meaningful life lesson regarding adrenaline. It operates as a brilliant narcotic liar, and when it recedes, the central nervous system demands a devastating tax. Celine exhibits severe autonomic tremors, dark blood mapping her pale features. Luca clinically scans her anatomy, asking if she is fundamentally broken. She offers a dissociated denial. Luca offers a flat murmur of validation, praising her emotional regulation under extreme duress. When Celine angrily protests that they were nearly butchered, he counters with a chillingly detached metric: she is still consuming oxygen. We uncover a simple, meaningful life lesson within his toxic stoicism. Psychological comfort becomes entirely irrelevant when raw biological survival is your final remaining currency. Sitting in the desolate cabin with blood-coated hands, Celine suffers a profound psychological fracture. She recognizes she is successfully adapting to this pathological cycle of violence. Soon, a rogue faction retrieves them. They descend into a fortified bunker where loyalists prepare for a siege. At the epicenter stands Margaret, projecting undeniable cold authority. Margaret dispenses with social pleasantries, providing a stark assessment of their collapsing reality. Vittorio, the narcissistic patriarch, is weaponizing corrupted officials to frame Luca as a deviant traitor. When Luca asks if she can mitigate the damage, Margaret issues a definitive negative. The kingpin's fragile ego requires public execution, regardless of the cost. Take note of this simple, meaningful life lesson. A megalomaniac who feels their total control slipping will enthusiastically incinerate their own empire just to punish a defiant subject, demonstrating classic detachment. Luca calmly states his plan to assassinate his former captor before midnight. Margaret diagnoses the operation as a suicidal ideation, but Celine, entirely numbed by trauma, offers a hollow nod. Exhaling a heavy sigh of resignation, Margaret agrees to digitally eradicate their identities, purchasing a temporary window of invisibility. Her diagnostic condition is absolute. If this surgical strike fails, they will remain hunted anomalies for their brief remaining lifespans. Keep this simple. Meaningful life lessons close to your heart. When you permanently sever your trauma bond, you must be fully prepared to navigate a violently hostile environment. Luca processes the warning without a single micro-expression and fueled entirely by a pathological need for closure. The primary target is Vittorio's lavish restaurant, the syndicate's operational core. Luca believes the inner circle gathers there tonight. It is either a tactical masterpiece or the ultimate psychological trap. Let us analyze this pivot together. Moving with the cold geometry of a tactician, Luca selects 8 sociopathic enforcers, all willing variables in this equation. When Celine demands inclusion, Luca attempts to reassert a protector dynamic, citing her lack of conditioning. Celine shatters his cognitive dissonance instantly. Her violent reprogramming began the second he forced a weapon into her hands. Consider this simple, meaningful life lesson. You cannot force a subject to kill for survival and expect them to revert to a passive observer. Recognizing the irreversible neurological shift in her posture, Luca yields, restricting her to the extraction vehicle. By 10 in the evening, 4 dark sedans creep toward the glowing establishment, carrying the weight of impending slaughter. From the exterior, the establishment projects warmth, a masterful narcissistic deception masking a dangerous environment. Let us pause here, because you and I are going to unpack the psychology of this trap. Celine sits paralyzed as an extraction vehicle, observing through optics as Luca's strike team breaches the perimeter. Kinetic flashes of gunfire illuminate the frosted glass. Suddenly, the entire paradigm collapses. The second floor is instantly vaporized by a massive incendiary detonation. A concussive wave impacts her vehicle as flames devour the structure. The simple, meaningful life lesson here is stark the exact moment you assume you have outmaneuvered a megalomaniac. They rewrite the rules. Deafened by the blast, Celine sprints directly into the roaring inferno. Visualize this behavioral anomaly. Civilians scatter as debris falls, yet Celine actively moves against the current, pushing into the epicenter. She navigates a claustrophobic environment of shattered glass and extreme heat. Near the ruined bar, she restrains a bleeding loyalist, demanding Luca's coordinates. A trembling hand indicates the kitchen. This exposes a harsh, simple, meaningful life lesson. The pathological gravity of a trauma bond will override our deepest biological imperative to survive. Inhaling toxic smoke, Celine forces herself past mangled casualties. Finally, she locates him. Luca is pinned beneath a massive structural beam, entirely unresponsive. She collapses to the scorched floor, screaming his name in absolute desperation until his eyes painfully drag open. We observe the charred beam compressing Luca. Arterial blood expands across the fractured tiles. Celine embeds her hands into the blistering wood, exerting maximum force, but the weight is static. As the fire escalates, Luca begs her to abandon him, a manifestation of his trauma-induced martyrdom. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. sometimes an irrational stubbornness, is the only psychological mechanism capable of shielding someone from death. Celine entirely blocks out his commands. She emits a primal cry, tearing at the hot timber. Suddenly, two burned operatives emerge from the toxic haze, applying their combined mass to the wood. The heavy structure finally shifts. Luca screams in pure agony as they violently extract his broken frame, while Celine relentlessly drives them forward to survive. Open this file with me, and let us examine the pathology of that night. Luca is dragged through thick smoke, his responses reduced to primal screams. Celine acts as his crutch, exhibiting high-stress trauma bonding as they hit the concrete. The structural collapse is a physical echo of their psychological ruin. As sirens approach, Celine displays acute hyperfixation. She interrogates a panicked soldier, desperate to confirm the death of Santini. The realization that Santini, a megalomaniac narcissist, was never inside triggers an emotional crash. He played their cognitive biases perfectly. Take this clinical truth to heart. The most fatal traps we encounter are the ones we willingly step into, blinded by our own assumptions. The red lights blur as Celine's nervous system shuts down. You and I have studied this rapid behavioral spiral in countless case files. Inside the stolen vehicle, Celine applies desperate pressure to Luca's arterial bleeding. Medically, his survival is an anomaly, sustained only by a rigid psychological refusal to expire. We move to the clinical intervention. Steel pins fuse his shattered leg, ensuring a permanent physiological deficit. They retreat to an isolated safe house, shedding their former identities. Observe this fundamental lesson. The exact moment physical trauma is inflicted, the conflict stops being rational business and mutates into a chronic, lifelong obsession. The atmospheric tension in that hideout is suffocating, acting as a psychological pressure cooker for an unspoken, deep-seated pathology of violent revenge. Review the environmental conditions of the safe house. Luca remains immobilized on a soiled mattress, his body fighting infection while rival factions dismantle his territory. Into this heavy, violent atmosphere steps Celine. Her affect is flat. She confronts a room of hardened sociopaths and maintains unbroken eye contact until they submit to her dominance. They deeply miscalculated her baseline resilience. Within a fortnight, her network locates Santini, decaying in a farmhouse, suffering from acute paranoid psychosis. Celine delivers this intelligence directly to Luca. Retain this brutal clinical lesson in an environment devoid of empathy. True authority is never inherited. It is forcefully extracted by the few capable of bearing its crushing psychological weight. The ambient stress in that room is physically palpable. Luca forces his frame upward, his pupils dilating with primal hostility at the mere mention of Santini. Disregarding his severe physical limitations, he demands a dawn raid. He insists on witnessing the megalomaniac perish. Celine, however, exhibits a profound behavioral shift. Sitting on the mattress edge, she calmly requisitions his two best marksmen, stating she will execute the target herself. Luca experiences immediate cognitive dissonance, begging her not to fracture her moral compass. Grasp this simple, tragic lesson. We subconsciously filter out the terrifying psychological mutations occurring within the people we attach ourselves to. He is entirely unequipped to process the cold predator she is rapidly evolving into. Examine this interaction closely with me, for it marks the exact point of no return. Luca grasps her hands, his verbal pleas reflecting a desperate need to preserve her innocence. He rationalizes his own disposable nature, projecting the savior role onto her. Celine initiates tactile contact, her tone stabilized. She articulates her conscious acceptance of this new reality. She chooses the violence, the syndicate, and above all, him. This unconditional attachment shatters his emotional defenses. He weeps, surrendering his men. By dawn, Celine arrives at the rural compound, mechanically racking a fire farm with alarming proficiency. Keep this clinical lesson in mind. Profound emotional dependency acts as a heavy anchor, and holding on too tightly guarantees mutual psychological drowning. The megalomaniac's empire has degraded to a skeleton crew shivering in the mud. It is the textbook conclusion of unchecked narcissism. Silence blankets the property as Luca's technicians disable the power grid. Celine and her tactical unit navigate the terrain with predatory efficiency. The perimeter security is neutralized via mechanical asphyxiation, bodies dragged into the dark. The structural breach is violently sudden. Inside, the environment reflects a severe cognitive breakdown, stolen masterpieces hanging above rotting food waste. The olfactory evidence of raw, primal fear is overwhelming. Celine regulates her respiration before ascending the stairs. Learn this simple, clinical lesson. Absolute systemic ruin takes root in the psyche long before the physical body is ever compromised. The psychological climax occurs as the door breaches. Santini presents in a depressive posture, illuminated by harsh morning light. A heavy caliber weapon rests idly on his lap. He makes eye contact, his features slacked by prolonged adrenal exhaustion, whispering that she is late. Confronted with lethal force, his response is inappropriate, affect a dry, grating laugh. He verbally deflects, blaming his collapse on a minor dispute, projecting his failure outward. As his motor functions jerkily raise the firearm, Celine's baseline empathy fully flatlines. She discharges the weapon 3 times without a single flinch. Never forget this simple, psychiatric lesson. When you systematically eradicate every single thing a subject values, you manufacture an entity completely devoid of fear. The former kingpin experiences hemorrhagic shock, collapsing onto the hardwood. We observe his respiratory system failing. Through stained teeth, he expresses genuine surprise at her capacity for lethal violence. Celine enters his fading vision, displaying a textbook dissociated stare. She quietly admits her own surprise at crossing this behavioral threshold. Santini offers a final grimace, welcoming her to his level of sociopathy before brain death occurs. A profound quiet settles in. Celine evaluates her trembling digits, recognizing the permanent neurological rewiring of her conscience. Take this simple lesson to heart. Biological survival will constantly force adaptation, even if it mandates becoming the exact pathology we spent our entire lives trying to escape. The subject, previously showing an exaggerated startle response, has fully assumed the apex predator role. During the extraction, the endocrine spike dissipates, leaving Celine with severe somatic symptoms of emptiness. She fully comprehends her new categorization as the aggressor. Back at the facility, Luca remains hyper-vigilant on the porch, managing his chronic pain. Celine ascends the stairs, her posture defeated. Without establishing eye contact, she confirms the target's termination. Luca observes her flattened affect and probes for her internal emotional state. Grasp this simple, tragic lesson. A state of total, echoing psychological numbness is easily the most crushing weight a human mind can ever be forced to process. The fog obscures the porch as Luca presents a definitive exit strategy. Observing the blood on her garments, he outlines a complete identity, erasure, a secure location, funding, and total detachment. The condition is the permanent severance of their trauma bond. Should she remain, she must integrate fully into the syndicate's hierarchy. Celine weeps, accusing him of constructing a guild enclosure. Luca counters, noting that a cage requires a locked mechanism to function as a prison. She actively mourns the death of her former, neurotypical self. He initiates physical grounding, pulling her into his center of gravity. Hold tightly to this profound life lesson. The most resilient, hardened iterations of human psychology are always forged in the absolute destruction of who we used to be. Fluid trails map the stress on Celine's face. She fixates on her microtremors, acknowledging the moral contamination she has internalized. Luca closes the distance, reframing her violent initiation as proof of survival. Her voice fractures, revealing her trauma, executing a subject and feeling zero emotion. She is wholly dependent on him now, a textbook case of Stockholm Syndrome, violently bonding with the architect of her new reality. Luca smiles, clinically assessing that her fear of this psychopathy proves her core empathy is intact. By dawn, her paralyzing cognitive dissonance resolves into cold integration. She ceases her flight response. Accept this simple lesson sometimes. A terrifying psychological descent into the dark is the only method to achieve uncompromising control. Let us examine the genesis of this pairing together. Celine stares at the man who pulled her from the debris. For 3 years, her nervous system was trapped in a permanent state of fear. But extreme cruelty has a fascinating way of recalibrating the brain, teaching a victim to bare their teeth. Luca takes her hand, anchoring what I clinically classify as an evolved trauma bond. He swears she will not regret this descent. She whispers that tomorrow is an illusion, a promise no one can keep. His jaw tightens, a behavioral marker of his pathology, stating he will fight the odds regardless. In that pale morning light, 2 fractured psyches fuse together. It reveals an observable truth. Unbreakable bonds are forged in the brutal fires of survival, never in the quiet ease of comfort. 6 months of observation reveal a staggering behavioral shift. Bitter winds whip at Celine as she watches concrete rise into a sanctuary. This structure functions as an absolute fortress for those fleeing violent homes. The psychological irony is right there in the shadows. Every steel beam is funded by the laundered wealth of a ruthless syndicate. They are extracting the cold currency of organized crime and spinning it into salvation. To the unaware public, this is a standard corporate shield, but Celine bled her own clinical trauma into the foundation. She designed the escape networks, mapping the exact lifelines she once hallucinated during her captivity. It teaches us a profound lesson. True cognitive healing only begins the moment you forge your deepest pain into an unbreakable shield to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The sharp tap of a cane interrupts the ambient noise. Luca steps beside her, his dark suit failing to mask the physical deficit as his leg finally bears weight. Gazing at the rising steel, he murmurs, "She is a miracle worker." Celine offers a faint smile, claiming she is merely putting their violent revenue to practical use. Luca leans on his cane, probing her mental state by asking if she ever dissociates back to that violent dawn. Celine admits the ghost of that morning acts as a chronic stressor every single day, not as a symptom of regret, but as a chilling reminder of the true cost of dominance. Luca studies her with fierce devotion, proud she weaponized her ashes. Real love is never a pristine emotion. It is the defiant act of building a beautiful future directly on top of your darkest psychological ruins. We reach an intriguing plateau in this clinical observation. Celine rests against Luca, asking what other environment could sustain her now. He reminds her she holds the keys to her confinement, but both understand that innocent freedom is a neurological impossibility. Her mind flashes to that freezing apartment where she once concealed physical trauma and adopted an avoidance response. That trembling iteration of her psyche is dead, buried under thick cognitive armor. They retreat to a penthouse above the city grid. It functions as more than a paranoid bunker. Celine flooded the space with light, transforming a killer barren fortress into a regulated habitat. It leaves us with a powerful realization. Sometimes you must march straight through the blazing center of hell to finally find the one place where you truly belong. Picture this diagnostic baseline with me. An evening unfolds in an artificial atmosphere of normalcy. Celine moves softly through the kitchen, while Luca reviews documents like a fatigued executive. Strip away that domestic masking, and a severe reality remains. A loaded weapon rests beside the silverware with armed security outside. Later, Luca hands her a sealed envelope. You and I might predict a standard romantic gesture here, correct? Instead, she extracts the deed to the Wisconsin estate, the exact location where she first decoded his lethal pathology. She stands frozen, the stimulus triggering a massive physiological response. The paper trembles as she absorbs the weight of this calculated surrender. It leaves us with a vital lesson. True safety is never a lucky accident. It is always a deliberate, incredibly heavy choice. The heavy silence fractures as Luca's unblinking gaze locks onto her. He states the estate has been her legal property for 3 months. Celine stares at the document as it were an explosive device, her vocal cords strained when she demands a reason. His answer carries the grim pragmatism of a man calculating his own mortality. He requires her to maintain a secure fallback, insulated from his toxic environment in case he is eliminated. She exhibits denial, a common defense mechanism, swearing his empire will not collapse. But Luca operates purely on the cold math of survival. Defeated, she asks if his violent methodology ever induces remorse. He admits the collateral damage degrades his conscience constantly. Life teaches us that hope is a beautiful psychological comfort, but stark preparation is what actually keeps your pulse steady. Beneath his cognitive remorse, his tone drops to a persuasive frequency. He vows he will never regret the brutal adaptations required to survive, nor the variables that pulled her into his orbit. Celine exhibits a withdrawal response, verbalizing that she is merely a collection of shattered fragments. Luca intercepts her retreat. His lethal hands apply precisely calibrated, gentle pressure to her jaw, labeling her a masterpiece in progress. It is an objectively manipulative platitude, yet Celine emits a fractured laugh. This is a textbook manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome, leaning into him for a slow kiss, silently validating the boss for granting an illusion of agency. Outside, the oblivious population slumbers. True love does not magically erase neurological scars. It simply gives us a beautiful rationalization to wear them proudly. This is the exact moment everything shifts inside Celine neural pathways. Stick with me, because this is where the submissive victim profile permanently erases itself. She logically processes that adhering to fragile rules nearly terminated her existence. Now she manipulates the dark instead of avoiding it. A year later, we find them at the public launch of their philanthropic center. Politicians display synthetic smiles, and the media consumes the narrative of corporate saints. But you and I know the violent economics paving those polished floors. Standing beside her protector, Celine monitors the terrified women entering the facility. They display the exact hypervigilance she once suffered from. It proves a powerful psychological truth. Sometimes, integrating your own suppressed shadows is the only effective method to step into the light. Observing those traumatized subjects, a heavy sense of purpose settles into Celine's cognitive framework. After the media vacates, she and Luca inspect the corridors. She questions if this environment will actually rehabilitate anyone. Luca maintains an unwavering affect. He guarantees success, noting she utilized her own brutal psychological agony as the structural blueprint. Pausing under a skylight, Celine verbalizes her cognitive dissonance. She never hypothesized that the toxic violence which nearly broke her could be reverse-engineered into a therapeutic tool. Luca holds her gaze. That is the behavioral signature of a survivor, he murmurs. They adapt. When she asks if that utility is her sole value, he pulls close, securing their complex bond. It shows us that our darkest trauma can become our greatest psychological weapon if we dare to wield it. Let us analyze this critical juncture together. He notes that she took her victim narrative by the throat, aggressively rewiring the script to dictate her own outcomes. He classifies her as an anomaly, his voice strained by a rare display of emotional dysregulation. In the epicenter of this syndicate, they share a slow, validating kiss. A 2-year observation period elapses. Where do we locate the matriarch of this organization now? Positioned defensively on a psychiatrist's couch, she utilized avoidance tactics for months, harboring the irrational belief that internalizing her trauma was the ultimate metric of resilience. It was Luca who dismantled those rigid cognitive barriers. He demonstrated that true psychological fortitude is never found in solitary suffering. Real resilience is simply allowing someone else to help bear the heavy cognitive load. The syndicate boss delivered a blunt clinical assessment. Chronic avoidance is not a metric of bravery. It is merely a maladaptive coping mechanism. He showed her that the exhausting process of therapy requires the same endurance as surviving ballistic trauma. Celine engages in the grueling clinical work, mapping exactly how prolonged terror rewired her amygdala. When the clinician inquires about Luca, her facial posture relaxes. The relational dynamics are complex, yet stable. Does she trust an apex predator? Yes, but entirely stripped of her pathological naivety. The pivotal breakthrough occurred when he ceased infantilizing her and engaged her as a functional equal. Her ultimate victory was not securing a sociopath loyalty. It was the cognitive realization that she was her own primary protector. This proves we alone govern our neurological recovery. Examine the final diagnostic frame with me. The clinician labels her cognitive restructuring a marker of post-traumatic growth. Celine reclines, her eyes holding the data of extreme violence, softly correcting that it registers simply as survival. In their high-fatality environment, those two concepts are clinically indistinguishable. Outside, civilians execute safe routines, oblivious to the predatory ecosystem parallel to them. A digital alert sounds, a text from Luca. The megalomaniac narcissist is employing humor, threatening to cook dinner tonight. She inputs a sarcastic reply, mocking his domestic skills, agreeing conditionally on her selection of the wine. Stepping into the sunlight, she integrates a profound baseline. Healing does not mandate the deletion of traumatic data. It simply means granting your nervous system permission to process joy. Let us open the file on Celine. When she steps into this sociopathic ecosystem, her physiological markers spike. Hands trembling, rapid breathing. Yet, clinically speaking, true courage is not the absence of panic. It is the conscious choice to march forward anyway. 5 years of adaptation pass. We observe her now, standing before a mirror in a sharp blazer. The room is heavy with a partnership forged in violence. Luca, The apex predator steps into the frame. He studies her, murmuring that she looks beautiful. Celine deflects, a trauma-bonded smirk on her face, noting she just looks tired. It teaches us a fundamental truth about survival. The absolute strongest armor you can wear is the quiet, unshakable confidence of knowing exactly who you are. Luca smirks at the glass, validating her exhaustion. To him, her fatigue is a beautiful symptom of their shared life. We shift to a clinical battlefield, a massive gala crawling with corrupt politicians desperate to buy a public halo. Celine despises these hollow rituals, yet she manipulates them flawlessly, knowing their dirty money builds her safe havens. At the microphone, she delivers a calculated speech about surviving the impossible. She never asks for pity. The heavy aura of a woman who walked through hell is enough. Billionaires rush to hand her checks while she flashes a polished smile. This behavior teaches us a hard, undeniable truth. True power is not raw force. It is using the vanity of a broken world to build your own unbreakable empire. Away from the noise, Luca tracks her to a shadowed balcony. He wraps his arms around her, a display of territorial dominance, praising her words. Celine sighs, noting she barely spoke a dozen sentences. Leaning against the stone, she asks if he ever thinks about their traumatic beginnings. For a second, the narcissist's armor cracks. He confesses regret for the psychological damage he caused, yet his grip only tightens. He swears he will never apologize for fighting for her. Exhibiting textbook Stockholm Syndrome, Celine tangles her fingers with his, whispering they are a total disaster. He counters they are a beautiful mess. It teaches a very real lesson. Love is never pristine. The strongest bonds are forged in absolute chaos, deeply scarred, but undeniably your own. Breathing the night air, Celine processes the scale of her conditioning. Look closely at her micro-expressions. This empire is her final clinical state. There is no spotless knight rescuing a helpless victim. The life she built is complex, laced with lethal threats, and cemented on a brutal foundation of trauma responses. But the fascinating part? Every piece of it is undeniably hers. She chose this jagged path, fighting with hyper-vigilant focus to earn her throne. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Luca, observing the glittering lights of their shared pathology, she accepts an ultimate truth. True freedom is never about desperately trying to outrun your darkest trauma. It is learning to walk straight through the terrifying shadows without ever letting them consume your mind. Today, you and I are going to unpack this case file and ask one final question. Was all this psychological chaos worth it? Looking at the results, the clinical answer is yes. Celine did the most terrifying thing a human being can do. She chose herself. She took the wreckage of a violent mob war and built an empire from the ashes, refusing to show remorse for adapting. As neon lights bleed through the heavy rain, Celine stands there, smiling into the storm. Her chronic fight-or-flight response has finally deactivated. No more hitmen, no lingering ghosts. She sits at the apex of the city, perfectly aligned with the biggest boss of them all. This leaves us with a profound lesson of her case. Sometimes, the only way to escape the consuming darkness is to stop running, turn around, and completely own the night. The deepest lesson from Celine's stories is that survival is only the beginning of healing. Escaping Grant physically does not immediately make Celine free. She carries fear in her body, confusion in her mind, and shame from years of being controlled. Then Luca's betrayal forces her to face another painful truth. She cannot build a new life by handing her choices to someone else, even someone who claims to love her. Healing requires self-ownership. Celine must learn to decide what she wants, not might react to what Grant threatens or Luca offers. This is an important educational message because many people think freedom means leaving one harmful situation. In reality, freedom also means rebuilding identity, judgment, confidence, and boundaries. Celine has to ask herself hard questions. Who am I without Grant's control? What do I want beyond safety? Can I accept Suki's love without accepting his lies? Can I forgive without it becoming dependent again? These questions are not easy, but they are necessary. The story also shows that truth is the foundation of healing. Luca's promise of no more lies matters because trust cannot survive in secrecy. However, Celine is right not to forgive instantly. Forgiveness, if it comes, must be earned through consistent honesty and changed behavior. The viewers can learn that healing is passive. It requires legal protection, emotional support, self-reflection, and the courage to set boundaries even with people we love. Selena's final strength is not that she chooses Luca or rejects Grant. Her strength is that she begins to choose herself. The story reminds us that the goal is not simply to be rescued from darkness, but to become strong enough to walk in the light without belonging to anyone else's shadow.